Okay, that's great. All right. Well, look, I'm delighted that Brooks is back for the third time in about 8 months or 9 months. That's probably a record for presentations. In a text message yesterday, he did refer to the fact that he'd spent 400 hours so far on this topic.
No, since you asked me to do this presentation, I've got thousands of hours in this in the last decade. But yeah, Rick Russo did the presentation in November in Dallas, which I missed because I was over at Lancer. I hadn't been to Lancer in a while, but it's a phenomenal presentation. It really gets your head spinning and making you think about all the stuff that went on at Bethesda. And so, Neil, you asked me if I somehow could arrange with Rick to do this presentation for you guys over there in the UK, and Rick was happy to oblige. So he's on board with us today.
I mean, sort of independently to that, Brooks, I heard Rick on a podcast with St. Patrick last year, I think it was. It was absolutely fascinating. So I suspect that this is going to be a talk involving ambulances and autopsies and rooms and all sorts of shenanigans. In terms of the format, Brooke has requested that we don't actually ask questions in the chat. We don't interrupt until there's a convenient break in the presentation, whether that's all done or whether that's an interim stage where we can have a drinks break or a comfort break. So please don't interrupt and just save up your questions. But obviously, before we actually start the formal presentation, if I could just ask both Brooks and Rick to introduce themselves, go over their bios and how they got into the JFK assassination. I mean, obviously we know Brooks very well. This is Rick's first interaction with Dealey Plaza UK, and moreover, of course, this is being recorded and is going out to a wider audience. So if we can just get the context and the background for the two researchers and then get into the meat of the presentation, please.
I'll go first and keep it short. I got drawn into really the study by reading David Lifton's Best Evidence, which I'll talk about. My mother was born on November 22nd in 1931, the day of the assassination, on her 32nd birthday. And she was born in Southampton, Long Island, in the same hospital as Jackie Bouvier. They were born about a year and a half apart. She loved the Kennedys, absolutely adored Jackie. My father was a Goldwater Republican, so they just canceled each other out at the polls. But she was devastated by the assassination. I have, she was one of these more than 1 million people that bought Manchester's The Death of a President when it came out. They sold more than 1 million copies within a few months of the release. It sat on the bottom shelf of our coffee table for years and years. And at some point late in life, I went through it. And it's a heavy lift. I mean, Manchester waxes poetically. He was telling a story really for, I would say, the high society set, not for us folks in the Midwest who are quite had to look up about every other page, would have to look up one of the words in the dictionary. But it was Best Evidence that lured me in. But I was involved with running a business, family, and everything. And other than paying attention to a few things, reading a few articles, I really didn't get back into it until 2013. And so I've been at it hard now. I'm in my 12th year of really digging into this, thousands and thousands of hours spent over that period of time. And this is one of my key topics. And so Rick and I collided with one another several years ago. His story, his experience, his knowledge in all of this eclipses mine in a big way, but we feed off of each other. Things that we find, we share, we go back and forth, and that's been highly productive, I think, in getting us to today. So that's my story, and I'll let Rick tell his.
Well, let's see. I guess for me, it began in September of 1991 when I saw a documentary series on an American cable channel, A&E, called The Men Who Killed Kennedy. And I had no idea that this was actually a series produced by a British filmmaker for Central Television, because the way that the Americans were presented this material, they had an American do the voiceover narration. So at the time, I thought A&E had actually created this series, only to find out that it was British. And I found it to be so serious about the subject matter, unlike the way that American news and media networks had treated it, that I was actually in the video distribution business at the time. And I looked into seeing if the video rights for this series was available, and was surprised to find out that it was. A&E had only acquired the TV rights. And I was fortunate enough to get for North America the video rights for the 5-part series, The Men Who Killed Kennedy. And once I did so, I felt a certain responsibility to the material, because shortly afterward, in December '91, the JFK movie came out, and all of a sudden, for a number of months into 1992, the entire country is talking about the Kennedy assassination. Unlike the Stone film, which takes theatrical license with some of the information within, this documentary series dealing with actual witnesses and so forth and so on, was considered more truthful information. And I felt a responsibility to learning more about the subject and representing this material as best as I could. And I can't quite remember exactly how it came about, but the catalyst for this was in May of 1992. The Journal of the AMA, JAMA, came out with an article interviewing Drs. Humes and Boswell, the 2 autopsy doctors at Bethesda. And the agenda for this, at least in my opinion, was to pretty much try to put the lid on the momentum that the Stone film had created, looking back, having people start to learn more and look back into the JFK assassination. And what came out of the JAMA article, I felt was aggravating, to say the least. And oh, by the way, a tidbit on that. The JAMA article, which, by the way, was the lead story on all the network news shows that night, and the front page of the newspapers the following day, actually came out a day before the movie JFK was released on video in the United States, to the tune of over 450,000 rental copies. I don't think that's a coincidence. But nevertheless, the JAMA article spawned, I think, a new generation of people who delved into this. People like Gary Aguilar, David Mantic, Jim Fetzer. I call them the class of 1992. And I think I was a part of that to a degree as well. But because of the JAMA article, that was a catalyst, and through the help of Paul O'Connor, who was one of the Bethesda witnesses, I actually assembled 5 of the men who were at Bethesda that night in Pittsburgh in December 1992. And that little get together was also attended by forensic pathologist Cyril Wecht and radiologist Randy Robertson. And and from there, I started to learn more and more about the subject, and started going to more conferences and meeting more people and talking to more witnesses. And the one good thing about having the video rights is that people would contact A&E wanting to purchase a copy of them, and they couldn't. And A&E would then forward these people to me so they could buy them. And a few people came out of the woodwork during this time with stories and information about the assassination because they couldn't reach a Nigel Turner or an Oliver Stone, and ended up speaking to me, and I came up with some very interesting information from that as well. But you know, and then one other thing, because I don't want to keep you, is that as these people contacted me and I learned more and more about certain aspects of the assassination, the A&E created a new channel called the History Channel in 1994-95. And they realized that the video right, I had actually sublicensed the video rights to them by that time. And they realized that they needed them for the History Channel. And so I said, okay, I'll do that on one condition, that we create a new episode for the series that would run coincide with the premiere of the series on the History Channel. And so I co-produced episode number 6 with Nigel Turner called "The Truth Shall Set You Free." And then a few years later, Nigel contacted me in 2003, and I was also consulted on a show called "The Smoking Guns," which I believe is episode 7 in the series. And I think that pretty much brings us up to date. I don't know if you have any questions. Or...
I did actually have one question, Rick. One of our members suggested that Nigel Turner would be a good guest for us. Is he still alive? And do you have his contact details?
No, he disappeared after the whole controversy of episode 9, The Guilty Men, and the heat that the network received, the American network received, A&E and its parent company, from LBJ's former press secretary. His name's escaping me right now. I don't know why I can't remember it, because he's very prominent. He was made.
Jack Valenti.
I'm sorry?
Was it Jack Valenti?
Yes, thanks, Brooks. Jack Valenti. And Valenti brings in 2 former presidents, Jimmy Carter and Gerald Ford, to put pressure on the networks. And needless to say, after running for about a week or so, the series was pulled. It was banned, which in television history in the United States, I can't think of any other show that was actually banned after it already had aired, you know? And so after that whole controversy, sometime after that, we just lost touch with Nigel altogether. I have no idea if he's alive or dead, or whether they paid him $1 million to go away, or what the deal is, but it's a great mystery to me.
Okay, that's great. Thanks for clearing that up. Okay, Brooks, you want to start then?
All right, let me see if I can't. Okay, we good?
Yeah, we can see that fine.
Okay. To get this effort off the ground, Neil asked me if I could kind of do an overview of the basics at Bethesda. So we decided to call this kind of Bethesda 101. This would make a great course at a college someplace, you know, where you got students for a whole semester, maybe 3 hours a week for 14 weeks. You know, you got 40 hours of which to present, and you give them a bunch of reading material. So I'm going to try to pull the nuggets out of this whole story, and then set the table for Rick to kind of jump in and take it from there with what he wants to talk about. And I'm going to try to do it in an hour. So we're in the last week of class, right before spring break. And we're just going to cut to the chase on this one. All right. Neil, you already covered this. I appreciate people respecting this. I've been in the presentations, and the chat kind of tends to take on a life of its own. And so it's running in parallel with the presentation. And as good as it is, you know, to get questions out and whatnot, there's a lot of chit chat, and it ends up kind of being a distraction. But all right, I think the story basically boils down to what you're looking at here. What the doctors, nurses, and people at Bethesda, at Parkland saw in terms of a wound in Kennedy's head compared to what the people at Bethesda say they saw when they first took Kennedy out of the casket and wrapped the head and examined him. And there's a huge disparity. One of the things that we have to consider, and I'm not here to impugn or indict the U.S. Navy or any of the people involved in this saga, because they were following orders. So Admiral Galloway on the right, he was the commanding officer of Bethesda, the entire complex. And then he had various captains that reported to him, Canada, Stover, others. Berkeley was kind of his peer. Berkeley was an admiral, but he was the White House physician. And he obviously would, in this whole episode, would have Johnson's ear to an extent, since he was based in the White House, and very easily would be the go-between, I think, on the night of the 22nd between whatever the White House was concerned about and the proceedings in the morgue, also interacting with the Kennedy family. So everything kind of flowed through Berkeley. The fellow on the lower left is a naval aide. That's Tazewell Shepard, the naval aide to Kennedy. And under his command in the White House were the two White House photographers that you see on the right, Robert Knutson and Cecil Stoughton. You're all familiar with this, the arm twisting that LBJ did to get Earl Warren to accept the leadership of the commission and to chair it. Same thing for Senator Richard Russell. And the early behind the scenes banter was all about, very much concerned about a communist conspiracy because of Oswald's background, having lived in Russia, handing out pro-Castro literature and so on and so forth. No one quite knew exactly. I think some did. Some knew what was going on, but the vast majority didn't. And so this was kind of the storyline. Let's kind of keep a lid on this and be very careful what gets out and the stories that are told, and because we don't want to start World War III. Three key men that we'll talk about in this are Paul O'Connor, and I've got Paul's name spelled wrong on this slide. Sorry about that. Jim Jenkins. The two of them were the laboratory techs that had the duty in the morgue that night. And Dennis David, who all three of these are a hero in this whole saga to varying degrees. I've met Jim Jenkins numerous times, interacted with him, was a hard man to get to. I think my take on Jim was that he was highly traumatized. If you've ever seen him, particularly observed him in person, I think to this day, what happened in Bethesda on the 22nd was really took a toll on him. And William Law was kind of his well, everything had to flow through William, basically. You couldn't really get to Jenkins, and haven't been able to over the years here, without getting through William. And one time I think it might have been this or another session in Dallas, I actually slipped a piece of paper to William with my name and cell phone and said, hey, I just need 10 minutes. And I never got that, but I think that William was trying to protect Jim. And obviously he's produced a couple books and had a lot of good stuff to chronicle what happened, and did produce some nuggets that nobody else did. So his effort was worth it. Speaking of trauma and the effect on memory, I found this story. Now this relates to veterans of the Desert Storm era, but post-traumatic stress disorder. I'm not saying that Jenkins was necessarily in that category, but my gosh, the man was 19 years old. He's done some autopsies before, but he's in there with all this brass. You got admirals, generals. It's fairly chaotic, and he's just trying to stay focused and do his job. I should have titled this slide differently. The article was titled "How Memory Works." It should have been titled "How Memory Evolves." One of the things that you encounter as you study this entire case and you read a lot of books, you see how memories of these various people change over time. And then some events will merge. And then in some cases, they'll claim ownership of something that really, it was someone else's observation, but they're latching onto it. So it's a bizarre journey that you're on as you read these testimonies and read stories and read these various books to kind of sort it all out. One of the things I did regarding the medical evidence, and this is just one page. This is a monstrous spreadsheet. And I tried to take input from Lifton, ARV, William Law's books, the House Select Committee, and just make out a massive spreadsheet where you see the little red dots here in the corner, a little triangle. That link opens up and gives you the reference. So this is massive. It's several hundred rows down. I don't know how many dozens and dozens of rows across. It would make great wallpaper. I got it about 90% complete, and then I got into something else, got diverted, and I actually never went back to it. But in this effort, as much as I tried to get everything in front of me to where I could have quick reference, still struggled to try to piece together some of the stuff. These were the categories as you go through the spreadsheet: the casket arrival, the casket opening and the initial observations at the opening, x-rays, photographs, autopsy details, the head wound and the brain specifics, the back wound, the morticians, and so on, finishing up with Doug Horn's concerns coming out of the ARB. To prepare for this, I reread Best Evidence, and I went through probably 700 or 800 pages, maybe 1,000 pages of Horn's 5 volumes. I think they total 1,700 pages. So it's a big lift to kind of go through and just make your way through all of this. What the advantage of actually reading what Lifton wrote and what Horn wrote is they wrote it in, well, Lifton wrote it in the first person, and Horn kind of writes it in the first person on behalf of the ARB. So you really kind of get some interesting perspectives based on that. The reading list, this would be too much for one semester. Be lucky to get a college kid to read one of these books, but and this is, I don't have it all here. There's a lot, but in terms of this particular theme, the medical evidence, the autopsy, the forensics, this would really be a tremendous reading list. If you get down to Aguilar and Cunningham, I think that's on History Matters, how 5 investigations got it wrong. That's a very interesting read. And of course, David Mantic had a book out that really detailed his take on the wounds, and he's got a new one out with Jerome Corsi. I've not ordered it yet. I just caught a quick glimpse of that the other day, and he attempts to connect a lot of dots. That's whether it's the Tippett murder or Oswald's escape or what went on in Dealey Plaza or any of these rabbit holes you want to go in. It's a real heavy lift to connect the dots, and you get involved in a lot of speculation. You get criticized for that. It's bad enough trying to fend off what we would call the lone nutters, the Warren Commission apologists, but we fight among ourselves, and we eat our own sometimes. The investigations, reason I'm creating these slides, when people go back and read, they can pause and they have some references here and some good material. But after the Warren Commission, the DOJ was digging into this largely because of all the books that were written, right? You've got Inquest, you've got Whitewash, you've got countless others that are being published, and a lot of people rush to judgment, people who are criticizing the Warren Commission, just beating them down. So behind the scenes, the DOJ is working on this, and they had 2 military reviews where they brought in people that were at Bethesda and had them look at the photos and x-rays. And we'll talk about that in a bit. The Clark panel attempted to take a look at it, followed by the Rockefeller Commission and so on. It's interesting that the Clark panel was created because Lieutenant Commander Boswell, who was one of the two autopsy pathologists along with Humes, petitioned the Justice Department to take a closer look. But then he later admitted, and I got this out of the 5 investigations reference that I gave you, that actually someone called from Justice called him and said, hey, would you write us a letter asking for this? So it was kind of a circular process by which the so-called petition to take a serious look at things began in the first place. The big takeaway is that the Clark panel moved the entry point up, and eventually the Rockefeller Commission agreed and the House Select Committee agreed. And the reason they did that is because on the left is a drawing of what the Warren Commission said happened. The bullet entered low in the back near the external octuple, well, EOP, tongue twister. It entered down close to the EOP, and this was kind of the path, right? Coming in downward, entering, exiting above the ear. You see it on the right. The problem with that is when you take a look at the Zapruder film, and the black line is true horizontal, and you check the path of the bullet as per the Warren Commission, it's too flat a shot. It doesn't work with the 6th floor of the school book depository. So the Clark panel moved it up, and then the House Select Committee agreed, made a drawing, and you can see the difference now. And it's explained by this illustration on the left. You see there the 4 fragments at the top, the Harper fragments on the left, which wasn't found until the day after on the 23rd in Dilley Plaza. Then you have these 3 bones that supposedly came from Dallas. Late in the evening, they were x-rayed. And what's interesting is that Clint Hill testified that when he got up in the back of the limo and looked into the car, there was a chunk of the skull with hair attached, scalp attached, sitting on the seat. Now, these 3 bones, from what I have read, are just pristine bones. There's no tissue, there's no scalp, there's no nothing. So trying to connect dots, where did they come from? And if just one comment, if the hole in the back of the head was really the one that I showed you early as seen at Parkland, these bones, the way they're illustrated, are coming from the top of the head. And if there was any hanky-panky and alterations done to get into the head, to get to the brain and whatnot, in that process, maybe these bones were removed. So the origin and the chain of custody of the bones is something to be studied. You can find JFK's autopsy report in the Warren Commission file, Commission Exhibit 387. This is what they told us about the wounds. You can see the supposed trajectory coming in through the back, out the throat. And you can see small entry in the back of the head, and then this large blowout above the ear extending into the parietal area. Nothing similar to Bethesda, right? And they were going to pass that off. There were 2 nurses that after Kennedy was pronounced dead, everybody left the room. There were 2 nurses and an orderly that were left in there to clean the body, clean the room, and prepare him for wherever he was going. If he was going to the morgue, if he was going to be shipped out, wherever he was going, there was just standard procedure. They would clean the body. One of them was a British girl, Diana Bowron, who had signed a contract, came over and started in September of '63 and was in the ER that day. She helped remove Kennedy from the limousine, put him on a gurney, and went in with that group into trauma room 1. So she was there in the beginning. Margaret Hinchcliffe is another nurse, and the 2 of them clean the body. Years later, fortunately, Harold Livingstone got to Diana Bowen, and they exchanged letters, and he got kind of to the bottom of what Diana saw there, and she drew this diagram. And clearly, she saw exactly what everybody else saw, but it gets even better. After cleaning the head and sopping up as much of the fluid that was still continuing to drain out of the hole in the back of the head, she had stuffed what she says were linens in there to kind of sop stuff up. After that was all done, she took large gauze squares and with her fingers pushed and filled this massive cavity in the back of the head. So she had her hands in the wound in trauma room 1. There's no better witness. And I took this diagram and then I kind of photoshopped it with these gauze squares, but you can see how much she said a very large portion of the right hemisphere was missing, slightly more than half by her estimate, and then a little bit on the left. As Kennedy's laying on the gurney or the table in trauma room 1, on his back, cerebellum is oozing out, and the cerebellum is way back, as you can see it in the lower rear part of the skull. And Carrickle, McClellan, Baxter, Jenkins, Clark, and others saw damaged cerebellum, sorry, tongue twister for this time of the morning. What's interesting is that when you look at the actual autopsy photos, right, of the brain, there is no damage. Latimer was, I think, the first third-party guy to kind of get involved and review the photos and x-rays. He made that comment, and so did John Stringer, who photographed the autopsy. We'll come to Stringer in a bit. Okay, there were x-rays taken at Bethesda, and clearly, I mean, there was damage all throughout the skull, but when you look at the x-ray, the rear of the head seems to be intact. Fortunately, the incredible work that David Mantic did, having made numerous trips to the National Archives, he did an optical density test on the various portions of the skull, and he found that this area back here was several orders of magnitude higher in optical density. And the only way that that could be done is it's an artifact. In other words, they took this x-ray and they filled in the hole that was back there. Then on the right, there you can see the yellow arrow is one of the very small, there are only 2 very tiny fragments that were found and removed from JFK's skull. There's one of them. And then the red arrow is that mysterious artifact, the 6.5 millimeter, arguably, could it be a bullet? I mean, does a bullet's fragment, but do they really slice right in half? Or is this the actual bullet laying perfectly aligned into the angle of incidence of the x-ray? What the heck is it? And what's interesting is over the years, as they were queried on this, Humes, Boswell, and Fink, the 3 doctors at the autopsy, all said they never saw this on the night of the assassination when they looked at the films. Okay, 2 photos showing the back of the head intact. This actually caused a lot of problems as people would come back and circle back and had access to this. Gerald Custer, the x-ray tech for one, and there were several others that were persuaded and bought into this idea of this is exactly what the head looked like. But arguably, it was done through scalp manipulation. Boswell has been on record saying that, and Doug Horn actually took the photos up and spent close to a week at Kodak. They did about $50,000 pro bono work. And when they looked at these, and there were other people involved too, they did stereoscopic analysis and whatnot. They say, no, the images look okay to us. Mantic disagrees. He's studied these closely, and he says there's something odd about these pictures in the back of the head. But yet, the apologist could win the argument to say, no, 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 maybe there was a hole. You can't quite see the entire wound because they've manipulated the scalp. They've actually pulled the scalp over to kind of cover up the hole. To that, I say hogwash. And in the autopsy report, in the middle of this slide, you see some fine print. They're talking about 4 tears that were in the scalp, A, B, C, D. Sorry, I have a small dog and my wife is returning from an errand, so hang on one second. Okay. All right. Lifton made an attempt to explain how these 4 tears, and Oswald and Humes actually has it in the report. They created essentially 4 flaps. 2 of them coming towards the front part of the head, and according to Lifton's interpretation, 2 of them going toward the back. When you read the detail, if you go down in the fine print here and you look at A, it says from the right inferior temporal parietal margin anterior to the right ear, that means in front of the right ear, to a point slightly above the tragus. The tragus is this little tab right here, if you can see on where I'm touching here on some of you. It's that little tab there in the kind of the middle in the front of the ear. So the tear actually extends down in front of the ear. So Lifton has it in the wrong place. The other one went forward and came came down just beyond the hairline over the right eye. So I repositioned B as well. So, but the point being is there were 4 flaps. So if you study this for a while, you know, people can look at the diagram and say, well, the scalp was manipulated. But if you take Humes at his word that when he got the body, magically there were these 4 tears in the scalp, and of course the big defect, you essentially had 4 flaps, which you could, in theory, peel back, retract, and see have a lot more access. And he goes on to say, and Boswell did too, that as these flaps were pulled back, pieces of bone of the skull were attached to the flaps, and other pieces of bone just simply fell away. That's their story. But conveniently, when they get the body for the first time, there's 4 tears in there. And one can surmise that it was sufficient that if there was some hanky-panky going on prior to them having the body in the morgue, that these tears were sufficient to open up the head and get the brain out, get to whatever fragments were there, and do what they needed to do. The last comment is, just look at the basic geometry of all of this. You've got 4 flaps that all meet around the defect. This is comical. Unless these are made of spandex, you can look at this. There's no way to take and turn and move any of these flaps to cover up the defect. It's impossible. One of the things that Bowron did is when looking at the back wound, this is key too. She said as they were cleaning him, they kind of rolled them over on his side to wipe off the back and everything. And she recalls that there was a small hole. She thinks it's lower. This is an image that Livingstone sent to her, and he's marked it up. He's pointed at everything. Goes, where was the hole? Her one comment, and this is her handwriting, this is not the back I saw. But she thought the hole was lower in the back. It was small. And comparatively, she says it was actually a lot smaller than the hole in the front and the throat. The official timeline. Rick asked if I would definitely have a slide on this, but so you can see Air Force One lands at 6 o'clock, and you can see the rest of it unfold here. The 2 highlighted lines, Rick is going to get into this delivery of a casket at the rear of the hospital, and it happened before the ambulance got to the front. Now, depending upon who's watch, if you're talking to the FBI, if you're talking news reporters, I mean, there's a lot of sources for this information, Secret Service, and their times vary a little bit. You know, the ambulance, did it get to the front at 6:55, 6:58, 7 o'clock? It varies a little bit. The interesting thing is that in order to make the timeline work, because the autopsy started, according to Humes, this Warren Commission testimony, at 7:35. That's when they received the body. Well, if the body is in the Dallas casket at the front of the hospital around 7 o'clock, there's plenty of time for it to come around to the back, be brought into the morgue, the body taken out, put on the table. That all makes sense. And to make that work, you have to have the 2 FBI agents, Seibert and O'Neill, along with Kellerman and Greer, the 2 Secret Service guys that were in the front of the limo in Dallas. The 4 of them carry the casket in. At 8 o'clock, supposedly, the military honor guard, who's been searching for the casket all this time, finds it, and they bring it into the back of the morgue. And that's when the pathological exam begins. O'Connor, gosh, I spelled it wrong again here. I was doing some of this late last night, so I'll have to make some editorial changes here. But Paul O'Connor enters the time in the morgue log. He specifically recalls, I put it in at 8 o'clock. Of course, the morgue log disappears, as does the log in radiology. So we have no way to go back to that. The first incision was made at 8:15. Now, was that the Y incision, or was that an incision on the head? Because there were people there that saw Humes actually take a scalpel to the head and then do some additional cutting. Lifton's hypothesis, when he gets to the end of his journey, he proposes that the casket, when it lands in Andrews, is empty. He doesn't know how the body was removed, when and where, but he has 2 theories in this. One, it was empty. It was already out of the coffin when it was loaded onto Air Force One at Love Field in Dallas. So the image is on the left. That's an empty coffin. That's option A. Option B, they took it out of the coffin during the flight back to Washington. And that's a rabbit hole you can go down to. A lot of people have worked on that. But either way, by the time it lands at Andrews, the coffin is empty. There's the great mystery. We're not going to solve that today. I have, real quickly, and I'll make this, I can send this file to Neil, and anybody's interested in having access to some of these spreadsheets and whatnot. But one of the things I did to try to get all the data in front of me is I took all these witnesses, both at Parkland and Bethesda, and just made I got a wrong slide in there. Sorry about that. I'll have to correct that. That's not the Parkland witnesses, but anyway, hold on, let me see if I can find that. Just give me a couple minutes here. No, it's still wrong. I got a bad slide, so. Okay, here's the correct one, if you can see this. I'll get that corrected in the slide deck, I'm sorry. But here are the witnesses at Parkland. And you can see how many the Warren Commission interviewed or deposed. You can see the ones at the bottom here that William Manchester spoke with. He doesn't really talk to any of the doctors or nurses. He talks to the administrator, Jack Price, the assistant administrator, Steve Landrigan, Earl Rose, of course, the undertaker, the 3 priests, Earl Cabell and Henry Gonzalez, several, there's a longer list too, but he's talking to politicos and administrators and whatnot. He never talks to any of the doctors or nurses. The House Select Committee, just a disclaimer in these slides, the House Select Committee is it's an incomplete list. And I need some help with that. That's part of, I think, the follow-up research that can be done on this. Rick may want to comment on that at an appropriate time, but these House Select Committee depositions and interviews, we need to create a database on those. Some have been transcribed. You can find some of them on History Matters, but it's really an incomplete list. Some of them were hidden. Of course, all of those were designed to be kind of kept under wraps for 50 years, you know, so we were never supposed to see any of that. Okay, the DC witnesses, this one is correct. Manchester, you can see who he interviews to create his book, who Lifton does. The Assassination Records Review Board talks to a few of them, deposes the 2 FBI guys. And here's the rest of the witnesses, a lot of Bethesda people and so on. So it's just a good, convenient place to go. One thing that I wanted to show you, okay, this first column right here, that's the do not talk order, the yellow column. And Lifton, basically through a Freedom of Information type request, was able to get a document that defined the 13 people who signed the order at Bethesda. And so they're identified here. Unfortunately, when he is talking about this, he doesn't give you the name. He says the 3 pathologists, the 2 x-ray techs, and he describes them by their position, not their name. He lists the medical illustrator, where you can see I have the question mark. I don't know if that was Skid Rydberg. And then he also says number 13 was an unknown Navy officer whose name he had never heard of. I found that very perplexing, but he doesn't, in best evidence, he doesn't give us the name of either the medical illustrator or the Navy officer. So it's a good reference page. Now, at some point, they had to take the autopsy report and convince everybody at Parkland that what's in the report is accurate. So I believe it was the Secret Service who took the report, made a trip to Dallas, and spoke with these guys. And one of the things I thought about, well, you've got doctors and nurses in Parkland, you've got pathologists and professionals of that trade in Bethesda. You've got civilians in Parkland, you've got military people at Bethesda. So, you know, what kind of standoff do we have here, and what kind of discord? And it's, you know, you're really trying to sell these people in Parkland who are experts in their craft. And it was a teaching hospital. These guys were highly skilled and highly trained. You're going to try to tell them that the autopsy got it right. So a couple years back, watching a baseball game or whatever with nothing to do, I started this process of just looking up all these guys at Bethesda. It's amazing to see. Now, it's less than 20 years from the end of World War II and a decade removed from Korea, right? These guys were all largely military, except for the residents and the younger guys. Almost all your senior people there were all military. And I'm going to highlight a couple. Malcolm Perry served in the Army. His ultimate boss, if you go down to the bottom, was Tom Shires, okay? Shires was not there on the day of the assassination. He was away at a conference. When he was given news, he commandeered an airplane at a local airport and hurried up to Dallas. He got in around 3 o'clock. So he arrives at 3 o'clock. And he's the chief over all of the surgery that's performed at Parkland. Reporting to him are Kemp Clark, who was over neurosurgery, Robert Shaw, who was the chair of thoracic surgery, and Charles Gregory, who was the chair of orthopedic surgery. So he's got this big bureaucratic flow of doctors underneath him. But ultimately, it's Malcolm Perry, who's a general and vascular surgeon. His ultimate boss is Shires. And again, Shires is not there. He does ultimately get involved in the treatment of Connolly, who's recuperating. When you look at Tom Shires, he's ex-Navy. He's done 2 tours, and he was stationed at Bethesda prior to the events of November '63. You go up to Robert Grossman, the second red little box coming down. He worked for Kemp Clark, and he was Army, and he had done a stint at Walter Reed. So it's fascinating to look at all of this, these people's background. And at the very bottom, the FBI agent Seibert O'Neill were both ex-Air Force. They both flew for the Army Air Corps in World War II. O'Neill was in the Air Force for a long time. He served through Korea. So it's fascinating to look at the background of all of this, given that the autopsy was done at a military installation. But let's move on. All right, as you sort this database, here are the ARB witnesses. There were 10 of them that were deposed. All 3 of the doctors, the 2 X-ray techs, 2 of the photographers, and so on. They also deposed the 2 FBI guys. The rest of these are just interviews, some in person, some were taped. I have to do that. I get all the cows in the barn, get it organized. So ultimately, I have a quick reference to kind of go to so I can understand exactly who's being interviewed and who isn't, and who's missing from the entire thing. More on that in a bit. Okay, there were 2 military reviews, as I said, that were done in the mid-60s to kind of stem the tide of dissent. On October 29th, the Kennedy family, who had been in possession of all the autopsy materials, photos, x-rays, the brain in a stainless container, the slides that were prepared, all of that they turned over to the National Archives to a deed of gift. And that same day, William Pitzer commits suicide in his office in Bethesda. A couple of days later is when they do the first military review. Fink is in Vietnam at the time. So it's Humes, Boswell, the radiologist, Eversole, and Stringer. They come back a couple months later, they bring Fink back from Vietnam, and they do a second review. So this is serious stuff. And the first one you could say might have sufficed, but Fink wasn't there. And they said, after some consideration, I'm sure they thought, we can't kind of pull this off and say, hey, we had the key people involved with the autopsy review all this stuff and everything's copacetic. Well, the problem is Fink wasn't involved. So they had to do it again. But through both sessions, everybody involved said, no, everything looks great. These are the photos and the x-rays that were produced from the autopsy. Everything's authentic. After 5 volumes and 1,700 pages, and Doug Horn does a phenomenal job of taking us through everything that the ARB was able to accomplish. His biggest regret, and he fought hard, is he wanted them to interview. He actually probably would have preferred a deposition. He would like to have seen a sworn deposition of both Paul O'Connor and Jim Jenkins. He couldn't even get an interview. They never spoke with either one of those men. But the key takeaway I would put at the top of the list from the ARB is that there was an examination of the brain that was done on Monday, the 25th, which was the day of the funeral. And I think they were actually maybe under the gun to try to get it done. Normally, after you put the brain in formalin, a couple of days isn't really sufficient. You'd be better off waiting maybe a week, maybe at least 5 days. Typically give it a good week, right? Because it sets up, it gets firm, and then it's easier to slice and take your sections. But anyway, they did it on the 25th. John Stringer took the photos, and the brain was sliced for examination. Several days later, maybe as early as the 29th, which would have been a full week after the assassination, after the autopsy, and perhaps a couple of days later, they don't know the exact date, there was a second exam that was done. Fink was not there at the first one. He was there at the second one. And the brain was not sectioned. And then in July of 96, here's the linchpin. The ARB puts John Stringer under oath, and they take his deposition. He looks at all of these images of the brain, of the photos, and he realizes he didn't take one of them because there's a film pack involved. The film type isn't correct. It's just a litany of things that are wrong with this whole thing. And of course, the brain photos that he took, included in the collection, were photos of the brain being sectioned. There's none of those. But in the second review that was done near the end of November, Those photos include the bottom of what's called the basilar view of the underside of the brain, which Stringer said he never took that photo. He is so perplexed by all of this. And again, he's under oath. At the very end, he says he could not testify that the brain that he's looking at in all these photos is actually the brain of the president. Okay. Jenkins and O'Connor, again, unfortunately had no contact with the ARB. They have different stories to tell. The biggest takeaway in this, and there's a lot, but I'm not going to go through all of this, but O'Connor said when the head was unwrapped and he got a good look at it, essentially there was no brain. The skull was empty, and then he gets pinned down and he says, well, maybe there was a little bit of material maybe clinging to some parts of the inside of the skull, but essentially the brain is gone. The skull is empty. And he's been quoted numerous times as saying there was, quote unquote, no brain in the skull. Now, Jenkins says there was a brain, and it got removed, and he and Boswell took it over into the container that had the formalin in it, and they infused it. But Jenkins talks about, and he did this at Lancer in 2013, and you can find this. There's a lot of material out there, but he says there's a lot of strange stuff about this brain, particularly the vessels on the underside where you would stick the needles in, because you just don't immerse it and soak it in formalin. You actually put needles in some of these vessels and you infuse the brain like you would infuse the body with embalming fluid. It's the same concept, right? So you want to basically have all this formalin flowing throughout the entire brain, all the vascular structures, to help preserve it. And he says those vessels were retracted. And he says that normally doesn't happen until several days or sufficient period. It's not a fresh thing. In other words, you cut those, you remove the brain, you take it over, you infuse it. These were pulled back, and there's other damage to the brain that Jenkins is confused. And he says it was a bit smaller than I would have thought, and so on and so forth. So he doubts it actually is the actual brain. That's what he told us. That was the big takeaway at Lancer 2013. And he chalks up the difference between O'Connor's take of the no brain in the head and there being a brain. Quote unquote, he's on record as saying, well, Paul and I kind of discussed this, and we just chalk it up to timing differences. I think that is exactly what happened. I may double back as part of the Q&A and kind of give you my version of what happened there, but I think they're seeing the head at different times. At the bottom, and I think many of you are aware of this, but when they look at all these photos, they're both on record as saying, this doesn't appear to be our morgue. The big takeaway from that is that the right lateral view of Kennedy's head during in one of these photos shows a phone on the wall. And they said that phone is in the wrong place. That phone was not there in our morgue. It was on the other side, on the other wall. And there's this passageway that leads out of the morgue to the back area where they have lockers, they have a specimen room, there are various little small rooms in the back of the morgue. And that's the passageway he's talking about. And the phone is actually, and their morgue was on the left side of that passageway, whereas in the photos, it's on the right. And they go into other things. The big one also being the photo that shows this metal stirrup, this U-shaped thing that's kind of suspended under the head that's holding it up. He said, we didn't use that in our morgue. That wasn't in our morgue. We used a chalk block, and it was a metal structure that sat underneath on the table and supported the head. So a lot of problems with all of this in terms of what O'Connor and Jenkins saw. Quick look at the two X-ray techs. They were hostile witnesses. By the time the ARB got to them in the mid-90s, they didn't want to talk. And they had to be subpoenaed, put under oath. They jointly agree that after the body was placed on the table, they were asked to leave, and they were sent back up to radiology on the 4th floor and told to wait. Again, they had to be subpoenaed, and they both agree after looking at all the x-rays that there's an x-ray of the neck that is missing from the collection. But their stories under oath to the ARB are radically different. Reed said they came back from radiology after about 15 minutes. He never saw the Y incision in the torso. He says all the x-rays were taken before. That's Reed. He took them all by himself. He took them up to the 4th floor all by himself without an escort. But he also says he saw Humes use a saw to cut the skull. Custer, on the other hand, said the wait in radiology was an hour. They took all the x-rays after the body was open, after the Y incision into the torso. And he took the x-rays with Reed as his assistant. Together, they took all the x-rays up to the 4th floor to be developed. And on his 1st or 2nd trip up there, he says as he was carrying them, so you got to go all the way back to the front of the hospital up to the 4th floor in the main part of what is building 1 to get to radiology. That's where it's at. And in that process of making that trip, he sees Jackie enter into the lobby or the rotunda there at the main entrance, but he's already taken x-rays. Okay, John Stringer, the medical photographer, he actually was the instructor. He taught at Bethesda for 25 years. He was the go-to guy. And what's interesting is he knows how to position the body, how to identify it, put little markers in there. There's a protocol you follow in taking all these pictures, right? But in a lot of these photos, that isn't followed. He took only color photos, no black and whites, but there are black and white photos in the collection. He surmises, well, maybe they made those black and whites from some of the color photos. He says Pitzer was never present. Everybody knew who Pitzer was. Pitzer was in charge of all the audio visual in the hospital. And he ran what was called the television operation within the hospital. So again, all the AV stuff. This is a problem you get into because everybody knew Pitzer, but none of these guys can remember him ever being present. He was in the morgue with Floyd Reeby, a corpsman who also took some pictures, but he took some pictures of, in the background, he had various people in the background, so the Secret Service took his camera, opened it up, and destroyed his film pack. He did tell, while they were in line eating lunch at Bethesda, he confided in Horn and said that his son, who was a captain, was up for promotion at that time to be an admiral. And again, when he was put under oath, he told the ARB that he doubts that the photos are Kennedy's. Okay, mystery man is Robert Knudsen, who was the lead photographer at the White House. And according to the story, he was rummaging around in his garage midweek and he got a speck or something in his eye and he had to get it treated. And so he did not make the trip to Dallas. He would have been on that trip. Cecil Stoughton took his place and took all those epic photos. There's a lot of speculation whether or not Knudsen took these photos. He looked at the photos and told the House Select Committee he was greatly disturbed. He said there were long probes. The body was sat up horizontally on the autopsy table, and they took long probes, roughly 2 feet in length, and they ran them through the brain from using several different, through the back of the body using several different angles. One of them actually involving the upper part of the chest. So they were trying to, in this effort, that according to Knudsen, they were trying to ascertain the trajectory, the path of these bullets through the body. But yet there isn't one photo in the collection showing any of these probes. But yet he was adamant that he had seen them. He helped develop, that's part of what he did too. He kind of supervised, he was the go-to guy over the White House lab at the Photographic Center and in Anacostia, which will come into play here in a minute. But all these photos eventually ended up being taken over to NPC Anacostia, where they were developed. They had a color lab, they had a black and white area, and there's an officer over there by the name of Sandra Spencer who comes into this because she ends up being deposed by the ARB and tells her version of events. But the question of is always, Stringer was in the morgue with Reevy. They both confirmed that they were there together and they were taking photos. No one can account for Knutson's presence. However, he didn't tell the House Select Committee, he wasn't asked, and he didn't tell them outright that he took the photos, but he was very familiar with the photos, and obviously was part of the group involved in the development of the films at the Naval Photographic Center. But he had died before the ARB was able to speak with him, but they did interview his wife and family, and she said that he told them that he took the photos. And to prove it, they put in his obituary. Okay. I don't know how long this has been, maybe 5 years ago, 4 years ago. There were things in Manchester's book, as you're reconciling this, and I go all the way back to that chart, and you're comparing what Manchester's saying to what Lifton's able to dig up, and of course they're interviewing different people. I was very curious to find out, when he went to Bethesda, he only spoke with Berkeley, Canada, and a lower ranking officer by the name of Weir. And we don't know who that is. Rick and I have talked about it. That would be something to, okay, Joe, hold on, we're not chatting. Oh, okay, well, I'll answer that question. All of Manchester's interviews are under wraps at Wesleyan University in Connecticut. And I took a trip, I went back east and I went out of my way. I spent a couple of days there. I went into the Olin Library in the special collections area. And you actually can see which boxes, which interviews are in. You can see that online. Nothing's available online. But by emailing back and forth, I was able to give them a list of boxes. So when I got there on the first day, they brought out a big cart. And I think there were 12 boxes in total. And I'm actually going through these interviews. It was interesting. When he interviewed Robert Oswald, they weren't transcribed. He actually had his yellow tablet, you know, his legal pad type yellow pieces of paper. And I'm holding in my hands his actual notes, whereas most of these are transcribed. Okay, but there's a wealth of information in there because a lot of this stuff doesn't end up in the book. Unfortunately, you can't get the interviews with any of the Kennedy family members, and you can't get any of the Secret Service interviews. They're all locked up. I was interested in looking at the interview that he did with the Undertaker, Vernon O'Neill, who was at Parkland. And okay, I'm getting to that, Joe. This is the actual, these are copies of the actual. Now I've blocked out the portions here because I signed a non-disclosure agreement. You have to do that in order. But what's interesting is they let you take photographs of all of this, but you can't reproduce these images. Okay, you can argue maybe I'm a little bit on the edge of the line here, but this is, I think there's 7 pages that I photograph. I've got dozens and dozens of these interviews. I spent several days there. This is just 3 of the 7 pages. You can see how heavily redacted these are, and they're largely Berkeley's comments. So I don't know if Manchester did that, or at some point, I think there was a checkpoint, if you will, a clearing process, and somebody went through these with a black marker and just redacted a lot of the Bethesda interview. But again, he didn't talk to anybody that actually was involved in performing the autopsy firsthand. Okay, this is relevant. This is one of the main reasons I went there. Manchester has a chain of custody in his book, The Death of a President. And at Parkland, he basically tells this story that to prepare the body for shipment in the bronze casket, that Vernon O'Neill got a rubber sheet and some plastic bags, and he wraps the head with roughly a half dozen, 6 to 7 bags over and over again. He's wrapping the head, shrouding the head with bags to contain any type of leakage. Well, he basically also got a rubber sheet. Doris Nelson brought these materials to Trauma Room 1. They laid a rubber sheet into the casket. And then he wraps the head 6 times over and over again with these bags. And then when he's done, he takes a rubber sheet and he folds it over the top of the body. Now at Bethesda, when you're reading the book, he says, there's a point where General Wheel is in the room, standing at the foot of the table, looking at the dead commander-in-chief. Again, it gets a little poetic here. He just says he's a marvelous specimen, as you know, I won't go into it, but it's over the top. But as part of that story that Manchester's presenting, he says, while he's standing there looking at Kennedy's body, the doctors are cutting the bags off the head. So if you connect the dots, one to the other, what Manchester has done, and this book was sold to millions of people, he's proven the chain of custody of the body. It left Parkland with bags shrouded around the head. And when it got to Bethesda, the bags were there. And Wheel, of all people, the commanding officer of the military district of Washington, was standing there watching them cut the bags away. Lifton then interviews Wheel, and Wheel says, that never happened. I was not in the morgue at that time. I was elsewhere. He was making funeral arrangement. He's worried about the stuff he's got to do the next day, the upcoming funeral. Where's he going to be buried? What do we got to do? Big responsibilities. So he's not in the morgue in the early phase of the operation. So Lifton then surmises that Manchester wrote his book just kind of by connecting the dots and leaves it at that. But in his interview with Wheel, when you look at the actual interview, there's no mention of it. So it didn't come from Wheel. So is Manchester involved in a cover-up in this whole process of writing this book? What you'll be amazed at the people he didn't talk to. Outside of a few employees in the Texas School Book Depository, the only people he talked to who were witnesses in Dealey Plaza were Ronald Fisher and Howard Brennan. That was the extent of the people that he interviewed. I mean, so and again, when he gets to Bethesda, he's not talking to Humes and Boswell and Ebersole and the rest of these guys, right? So you got to wonder what's going on. Now, he's fed this information. We really don't know where they're coming from. Was Berkeley the source on that? Maybe. What's interesting is that O'Neill does get, I think the casket costs about $3,500. He gets close to $14,000. He had to wait a long time. He had to go to Washington to get paid. Earl Cabell, who's now a congressman, actually helps facilitate that and gets O'Neill paid, which made me wonder in this whole process, was O'Neill the one who was put up to maybe creating the story about putting the 6 bags on? Because Diana Bowron and Margaret Hinchcliffe, who were in there cleaning the body, they never mentioned the 6 bags. Audrey White never mentions the 6 bags. Bowron, who was questioned repeatedly, exchanged several letters with Harry Livingstone, never mentions the 6 bags. So if it happened, it had to happen very late. And what's interesting about Parkland, real quickly, is that everybody involved was requested to produce a after action report. So they all basically wrote a report, gave it to Price, the administrator. This is what I did. This is what happened that day. Basic stuff. And again, in that report, they never mention anything about the 6 bags. They did say that when the body was all done and put in the casket, they said everybody left trauma room 1. Everybody left. And Mrs. Kennedy went in alone to be with the coffin. When you read Aubrey Reich's book, and he's been on record, once the body was in the coffin, he never left trauma room 1 until it was wheeled out in the hallway. So we've got different stories that we're trying to mesh, but if those bags were put on, I'm going to guess that they were put on. And here's a hypothetical. Talk about spitballing. The body's in the casket. Everybody leaves. Jackie comes in. Who's guarding the room, trauma room 1, the entire time until the casket leaves? It's Bill Greer. Bill Greer's in control of everybody going in and out. So maybe Jackie goes in alone. She's in there for a couple minutes. Maybe she has to take a potty break. She comes out and she says, Mr. Greer, I need to use the restroom. Maybe she wanted to take another cigarette break and she didn't want to smoke in the room itself because she had been smoking repeatedly out in the hallway. Maybe she steps out. Maybe at that point, Doris Nelson finally shows up with this rubber sheet and these bags and says, okay, Mr. O'Neill, I've got what you needed. They go back in, open the lid, and they do their work. Byron never comes back in the room. That's why she doesn't see it. It's difficult to connect the dots on some of this stuff. But anyway, my take on this is Manchester was trying to convince everybody there was complete chain of custody of the body, and we know that's not true, as we're going to see. I got about a half dozen more slides. Okay. The big break in all of this comes courtesy of Dennis David. Now, he did not sign a do not talk order. And in 1975, he's at the Great Lakes Naval Station north of Chicago, and a story appears in the Waukegan News Sun in May of 75, and he talks about these various things that happened at Bethesda. He says the casket was delivered to the rear of Bethesda in a black hearse, okay, not the white Navy ambulance. The 2 men up front were wearing smocks over their attire. Roughly 6 men in back with a casket got out and helped, and they were all civilians. None of these appeared to be military people. These men who got out of the back of the hearse assisted the sailors in bringing the casket in. The casket was a plain gray metal casket, often referred to as a shipping casket, shipping container. He said Humes, Boswell, and Stover, Captain Stover, were present. And he says Boswell was well aware that there were 2 caskets involved in this. So we got a bit of a shell game going on. The question comes out, obviously, is whose hearse was it? Now, Gallers was the official undertaker of record that evening, but there was another funeral home that had the contract with the Navy. So typically, Gallers would not be involved. What's interesting is Gallers had just recently moved from downtown DC up to a new place up on Wisconsin Avenue, where they are today. But they were at 1700 Pennsylvania Avenue. They were 1 block from the White House for decades and decades. So, and they had been involved in funerals of other dignitaries, other presidents. They were the natural go-to, even though they weren't next door to the White House, so to speak, anymore. That's why they were chosen. But they did not have the Navy contract. So typically, funerals involving deceased people being processed through Bethesda. If you want to use a local funeral home, it would, or even if you wanted to get the body, have it involved and then have it shipped elsewhere for a funeral, say in Ohio or whatnot. Anyway, this other funeral home would have been the go-between for all of that. An interesting comment is Captain Osborne, who at the time was the head of surgery. So he's Shire. Tom Shire is the head of surgery at Parkland. Captain Osborne is the head of surgery at Bethesda. He tells Lifton he thought that the undertakers that were involved that night were the ones that had the contract with the Navy, i.e. they weren't the Gallers people. So we don't know per se whose hearse this is. Okay. One of the people involved in preparing the body that evening was Tom Robinson. He deserves a lot of scrutiny. Okay. As you try to figure out, you know, when the Gallers people got there and what observations, you want to validate their observations and what they're on record saying. one of the men who was involved, Ed Strobel, was deceased by the time the ARB got into the picture. But they talked with Joe Hagan, and they talked with John Van Hosen, and they talked with Tom Robinson. Those three individuals were involved in the process of getting the body ready after the autopsy had been completed. Originally, when the ARB spoke to Joe Hagan, he had his facts all mixed up. It was bizarre. Before they spoke with him again, Hagan had called Van Hosen, and Van Hosen set him straight. And so the story was basically at that point, the Gallers team did go to Bethesda, and they arrived there around 8 o'clock. After the revised story being shared with the ARB, Hagan locates Robinson, and he makes Robinson available. And when you look at the Manchester account of all of this, because Manchester also interviews Hagan and Joe Galler, one of the Galler family, he interviews them back in May in '64. So this is just a half year after the assassination. So it's relevant when these early interviews take place, because they're fresh in everybody's mind. So initially, according to this interview with Joe Hagan and Joe Galler, the Gallers team took 3 vehicles to Bethesda. And when they left the funeral home, Joe Galler went in his personal car. Joe Hagan drove a staff car. He went separately. And it was Van Hosen and Ed Strobel who went in the 3rd vehicle, taking the equipment, which they typically refer to as house grips. But if you're going to embalm somebody remotely, you take all this equipment. And I did find out as I've met and done research and all of this, that Mrs. Kennedy, Jackie, when she died, was embalmed on her dining room table in her apartment in New York. So it can be done. It's not the typical thing. The important takeaway from Manchester's interview is there's no mention of Robinson. Hagan said that he and Robinson did take the hearse to Bethesda to deliver the Marcellus casket, but that's after midnight. Also, Robinson was the one who did the cosmetics. And when it was all done, there was a team that followed and went to the White House, but Hagan did not go to the White House. He remained at Bethesda to kind of wrap up things. One of the takeaways, and Rick and I have talked about this, there are experts in the field. You know, some people are they're simple practitioners. They do embalming. They're licensed, and you may not have an embalmer on staff in your funeral home, but you just call one of the licensed guys and said, "Hey, I need to embalm somebody tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock. Will you do it?" And they show up. But within the trade, there are also experts, people who are really, really good, have a tremendous skill set to put a body back together, to make it look good, to do the cosmetics. Potentially, it sounds like Robinson might have been one of those guys. Also, there's an individual we'll mention in a minute who's a mystery man in all of this, another mortician by the name of John Liggett, who was in The Men Who Killed Kennedy. And Liggett's reputation was exactly that as well. Okay, to kind of thread the way and get ready for Rick's presentation, there was a high level of security that evening, not only at Bethesda, but it actually began at Andrews, because there was a second ambulance that was sent over to Andrews. So there wasn't one, there were 2 white ambulances. One of them under the guise that maybe LBJ, who's had a heart attack in the past, we're worried about the new president. You know, we might as well have one on the ready in case it's needed. But the fact of the matter is, this second ambulance was a decoy ambulance, was always intended to be a decoy ambulance. It was a shell game. And this was discussed in a meeting room at Andrews before Air Force One ever landed. And so there was a plan, part of the security plan, to have this decoy ambulance. And that plan basically was this. they were going to do a shell game and distract people with the first ambulance, and it was the second ambulance with the body that supposedly was going to deliver to the back of the morgue. So basically, it was part of the security plan. It was a bit of a sleight of hand, a distraction, if you will. Here are the people that were involved in the military district of Washington. And if Rick wants to pull this up as part of his presentation, I can come back to it. Again, I got just a few slides remaining, but Wheel was the commanding officer. Lipsy was his aide, and Lipsy actually sat in and observed the autopsy. Rick will talk about that. He's key to all of this, because one of the things he did, which was brilliant, is not only did he want his interview taped, he brought his own tape recorder. So he really put the House Select Committee on edge, because he says, I'm taping it myself. You know, I can tell you Jim Jenkins wishes he had done that. Michael Groves was actually the commanding officer of the entire Honor Guard unit. Sam Bird reported to him. Sam Bird was second command over this group. Now, initially, when they go to Andrews, it's an all-Army team, right? That's the military district of Washington, principally. It's all Army. But yet there were enlisted men coming from different branches of the service, and the potential for a mixed guard was also in play. And there were numerous scenarios that were discussed, including, was the body going to be flown by helicopter, which there was a lot of uncertainty about that. But they were told to be ready for everything. This box that you see here that ends with the name George Barnum, those are the official 7 members of the Honor Guard, all interviewed by David Lifton, by the way, which is how he pieces together this shell game. Now, George Barnum is key. He doesn't get to Richard Godreau of the Air Force and George Barnum of the Coast Guard. He doesn't get to them until 1979. The others were interviewed much earlier. But Barnum is the last guy he talks to. And Barnum, at the request of his superiors, did an after-action report. And that is the critical piece in this, because when you read that report, he says, when we got there, the ambulance is in front, and then we went around to the back and we lost it. Then we came back to the front, couldn't find it. We went to the back. Hey, Gary, we're not chatting right now. I think you joined late, but please, we're not chatting. And then they came back to the front again, and then went back to the back of the morgue the third time. And on the third round trip, front to back, front to back, front to back, they delivered the casket at the rear, supposedly at 8 o'clock. So that's the Honor Guard. And then you've got these various people here at Bethesda, including Dennis David. Robert Carney at the bottom was a second-year resident, but he was in and out of the morgue. He was also in charge of security. Rick's going to talk about all of these guys in his presentation, and they all have critical pieces. Roger Boyjan was very important in this as well, because he was the Marine NCO who was in charge of their people in the Marine security. And he wrote an after-action report too, which was critical to all of this. Okay. After years and years of studying this and reading all this stuff and trying to connect dots, you get to the point where you've got things that you just can't quite figure out where they fit. In an earlier presentation, I talked about the tidy lady launderette and an individual who looked like Oswald, who around 1 o'clock shows up and abandons a station wagon and leaves. I went through that story, but it's kind of an orphan. As you piece that whole thing together, Armstrong and Harvey and Lee didn't know what to do with it. So he just kind of put it over on the side shelf and said, it's an orphan, I don't know where it fits into the puzzle. So we basically have we got 7 of them. We've got Pitzer's presence in the morgue was difficult to confirm. I think that's resolved, and Rick's going to talk about that. The sighting of the bullet in the morgue by Captain Osborne, I now believe is resolved, and I'm going to talk about that. There's a third casket in the morgue. So we don't have just 2. We don't have the plain gray shipping casket and the Dallas bronze casket. There's a third casket in the morgue, and it's a wood casket. It has an Air Force officer who's supposed to be buried at Arlington. So what is he doing at a naval institution? The casket was either rosewood or red mahogany with brass fixtures. It arrived mid-afternoon. Jenkins is convinced that it got there early before, well before JFK showed up. Jenkins and O'Connor reported to Jan Gale Rudnicki. There was a three-man crew. Rudnicki actually is in one of the back rooms. He's the guy who's preparing all the tissue specimens and the slides for future study. So that's what he was doing that night. But he was told when this casket with the Air Force officer showed up, he's told not to log it in, which defied protocol. And then he advises Jenkins and O'Connor of the same thing. Don't log this guy in. But it was gone by morning. Nobody really actually noted exactly when it left. That's a mystery. Here's another one. When the radiologist Ebersol first saw the body, he says the throat was sutured, and he told this to the House Select Committee. No one else ever saw the throat sutured. It was sutured much later on when the morticians were working on it. But he says no, when he first saw it, it was sutured. That's bizarre. Was it disinformation? Don't know. What's interesting is that when Mantek interviewed Ebersol, they went through a lot of stuff, and then he gets around to the X-ray that has the 6.5 millimeter little round perfect, what I will call an artifact, but you can see it in the AP X-ray. He asked him, "What about that 6.5 millimeter fragment?" And click, Ebersol hangs up on him. So what did Ebersol know? What was he involved in? He clearly probably was involved in making that fictitious X-ray that has the 6.5 millimeter fragment. So is this just disinformation? Here's what's interesting about this comment. If it were true, the body never left Parkland that way, because Bowron describes in depth the throat and the tracheotomy incision and everything. That's how it left Parkland. But yet when it arrives at Bethesda, it's sutured. That would play into the all of us conspiracy nuts out there and say, "See, I told you, somebody got their hands on the body, and while they were doing the alterations and whatnot, they just sewed up the wound." So what to make of that? Then, of course, you're all familiar, and I didn't produce this slide, but there is a photographer actually took a picture through the hallway door of a small little gurney that has this lump on it, supposedly a dead baby. And Lieutenant Sam Bird made note of that as well, that there was a supposed little lump of something on this gurney that was brought into the morgue. A lot of people speculate that was the actual substitute brain that was put into the skull, the one that Jenkins was involved in the removal, because when O'Connor sees the body first unwrapped, there is no brain in the head. So we go around and around with a lot of this stuff, and we have some things that we're trying to reconcile. Number 6 is, what role did John Liggett play in all of this? Liggett is in The Men Who Killed Kennedy. There's an episode, again, he was a skilled tradesman when it came to fixing up bodies. And I think the latest little interesting nugget on Liggett is he's buried, I think, right close by, almost, I don't know the proximity, but he and Roscoe White are buried very close to one another. And then there's the rumor about the dead Secret Service man that was really flying around in Dallas on the 22nd. And what is that all about? So you've got these different things in this whole story that you're trying to piece together. Okay, I've got 2 slides. Bullets and fragments. In regard to fragments, this is what we know. Tom Robinson, the Gallers guy, thought they found a fragment in the thorax, which is in the torso, essentially, upper the chest area. Custer said a fragment fell out of the back during X-ray. He said it was about 1.5 to 2 inches. You know, arguably that's not a fragment, that's a bullet, but he calls it a fragment. He tells Lifton in the 1989 video that Ebersol, the radiologist, grabbed it. But then he tells the ARB in 1997 that Fink was the one that grabbed it. But he's talking about a fragment, a large fragment. Officially, there were 2 very small fragments that were found, and that's in the official record in the autopsy report, and they were both in the head. Yet Dennis David that night was asked to type a receipt, and it was for 4 sizable fragments that he's described. So those aren't the 2 little slivers that were found in the head. He's typing a different receipt. And then Humes, Boswell, and Fink all denied seeing that 6.5 millimeter fragment that was in the X-ray. Now, as far as bullets go, this is what we know. And I start off with a question. Was that perfect 6.5 millimeter fragment as seen in the X-ray intended to be a bullet? Were they trying to suggest, hey, look, here's the bullet? Again, when Mantek questions Ebersol about that, click. The call's disconnected. The FBI were given a receipt for a quote unquote missile. Now, a missile isn't 2 little small slivers. The only official fragments on record, that's not a missile. Then we have the famous Belmont memo that was issued that evening that says the doctors have found a bullet behind the ear and they're in the process of removing it. We've got Captain Osborne, who wasn't just some low-ranking guy there in the hospital. He's the head of surgery. He said they found a bullet. And he held it in his hand and said it was put in a small envelope. Captain Stover is on record as saying there was a bullet in the morgue as well. He conceded that. Now we have Commission Exhibit 399, the infamous magic bullet. It's found on a stretcher at Parkland. It is brought, supposedly brought from Texas to DC, and at 7:30, Special Agent Richard Johnson turns it over to his superiors in the Executive Office building. So the Secret Service has the bullet officially at 7:30. Now, you arguably could jump in a car and drive to the morgue and be there by 8 o'clock with that bullet. O.P. Wright, who was a former member of the Dallas Police Force, I think he was an assistant chief, so he wasn't just a grunt. He is now head of security at Parkland. He writes a 3 or 4 page after action report of all the things that happened. He never mentions the bullet. But yet Tomlinson, the engineer who found the bullet on the stretcher, gave it to O.P. Wright. And that is not in the O.P. Wright report. And Tomlinson receives a call late on the night of the 22nd saying, don't talk about the bullet, keep your mouth shut. Something's definitely going on here. This is my theory. Last slide before I give it to Rick. There were 2 bullets that were in play. And here we go. As I said early on, Neil, 2, 2, 2, 2, 2. There were 2 men on the 6th floor around 12:15, seen by Arnold Rowland. There's a dark complected man in the far west window, and there's a white man in the far east window, which is the sniper's nest. Then there's 2 men who leave Dealey Plaza in a Rambler, seen by Roger Craig. The driver is dark complected. Matches Arnold Rowland's description of a dark complected man. And the passenger is white, looks like Oswald. There's 2 guns found on the 6th floor. One is a 6.5 millimeter Mauser, and there's a 6.5 millimeter Carcano. They found the first one, and then it became magically the second one in the official record. But everybody who saw that gun initially, Seymour Weitzman and others, basically said it was a Mauser. And then we have 2 victims who were shot. Kennedy is shot, Connolly is shot. Now, you can believe the magic bullet theory that it was really aimed for Kennedy and it went through and did all that damage to Connolly, or was Connolly a target? Were there people killing Kennedy, and was Connolly on the hit list as well? And why? And before I get to the last one, J. Gary Shaw told a story, I don't know, 6, 7 years ago in Dallas about a man who I think he worked at the carousel or was around the carousel or was doing a delivery, but he knew all the personnel and everything. He was at the carousel one day, and John Connolly shows up. I think he was driven by a state trooper. He shows up and goes upstairs into a room, and there's about 8 people in the room. There's Ruby, there's Conley, and there's this big meeting. So Conley's at the carousel. And the whole presentation that Jay Gary did was devoted to this story, the background and all of that. And he mentions the guy's name. But it's interesting that Conley's engaging with Ruby shortly before the assassination. So was there a hit out on Conley? Was Conley not playing ball with Ruby and his associates? And they decided to take him out as part of this plot. Arguably, what's interesting is Conley was the Secretary of the Navy when, after Oswald defected to Russia, it was Conley. It was during that time that Oswald's discharge from the Marine Corps is downgraded to dishonorable, which pissed Oswald off. And he actually made a trip, I think in late September, supposedly, shows up at Austin, and he's trying to get his discharge corrected. So you could argue that whatever Oswald thought about Kennedy, he was really pissed at Conley. So there's all sorts of things you can thread into this narrative, but the bottom line is 2 guys were shot that day. And you could argue that the damage that was done to Conley was a separate shot that never passed through Kennedy. And then there were 2 bullets found to pull it all together. One is found on the Conley stretcher in Parkland. But the fact is the bullet didn't look like CE-399. It was pointed on the end. And then you have the mysterious Bardwell Odom 302 report, which says, I think in the summer of '64, the FBI took the bullet, took it to Dallas, went to Parkland, showed it to Tomlinson. I forget all who was involved in that story, but Tomlinson was one. But I think O.P. Wright also looked at it. But it's a fascinating thing because Gary Aguilar and Tink Thompson actually tracked this down and got to the bottom of it. But that whole report is bogus. And when Odom was questioned on, he says, it never happened. I never had the bullet. I never went to Parkland. I don't know what this 302 is about. Again, it's a fictitious, and the report said, the people at Parkland said, yeah, that was the bullet. That was the bullet that was found on the stretcher. It was bogus. And then, of course, we have this bullet supposedly in the Bethesda morgue that conveniently falls out of Kennedy's body. And there's different witnesses that said it happened as they were unwrapping the body. No, it happened while it was on the table. Custer said is when we were taking x-rays, it fell out of the back. Could that very easily have been spun until it didn't fall out while they were unwrapping him? It didn't fall out while they out of the back. It actually fell out of the back of the head. And that's the bullet that's in the x-ray. So my take after looking at this and trying to connect the dots for all these years, I'm absolutely convinced there were 2 bullets in play. The bullet in Parkland was a Mauser bullet. It had a sharp point. It was found on Conley's stretcher. It was the one that went through Conley's body, supposedly. And it ties to the Mauser that reportedly was found on the 6th floor when first seen. And the other bullet ties to the Carcano, and it ties to Kennedy's body in the Bethesda morgue. It's that simple. That's exactly what they were up to. And this thread, this slide here takes you through the chronology of all of that. And you can see plain as day, there were 2 shooters involved. I've always felt there were 2 shooters involved. No one concocts a plan where there's one guy firing from behind, and in spite of all the forensics and all the witnesses and all the evidence, they're going to try to piece this thing back together and say, no, all the damage that was done was actually done by Oswald from the 6th floor window. Not on Kennedy's body, it wasn't. But they had to get that genie back in the bottle. And when Oswald was taken alive, the plan was always to control the autopsy. I'm not disputing that. Earl Rose was never going to autopsy Kennedy's body. That body was always going back to Washington, preferably to Walter Reed if they had their way. But yet it ended up at Bethesda. But either way, they had the body in Washington. The military controlled the autopsy. They weren't going to let Earl Rose get involved. But it's when Oswald is taken alive and arrested in the Texas theater that all of a sudden these guys are scrambling. And they've got to go to plan B, and they got to cover the whole thing up. I'll leave it at that. I do have one other slide I'll share at the end, but I'm going to pass it on to Rick, and I'll leave my screen share. How do we do this, Neil? If Rick is, I guess Rick can just talk over me, and I'll leave this up. But
yeah, you could show this slide unless Rick has got any specific dedicated slides himself. Has he?
These are his slides.
Slides. Okay, we can leave that up whilst Rick is speaking. I'm obviously very keen to bring in Rick, but can I just okay, that was entry level Bethesda 101.
Keep all your notes, because you really need to hear Rick's presentation. It's the other half of the story.
Okay, there's a hell of a lot to unpack there. Do you want your Q&A to be at the end of Rick's session as well?
Yeah, we'll do it all together.
Okay, all right, let's go.
I don't want to take away from. Now, Rick sent me this slide. He sent me the one on the left. I just took a satellite view to kind of give you a better feel of this, and it points out where all these buildings were. And 7 and 8 were brand new. They had just opened up prior to the assassination. And I'll let Rick take it from there.
Can you hear me?
Yep.
I apologize up front for my congestion this afternoon. I'd like to thank Brooks for a terrific presentation. I'm not going to do such an extensive presentation this afternoon. I think I'd really like to, after I share my information with all of you, get more into a conversational or Q&A situation, because I'm sure what I'm about to present you is going to bring up a few questions from the people that have listening in with us today. I think the best way to start this would be an actual review of the last 60 years, our understanding of exactly how the president's body was received at Bethesda. And we start in 1964 with the Warren Commission, where they stated that the bronze casket from Dallas was delivered to the morgue at 7:35 p.m., and that's according to Dr. James Humes. In 1979, the HSCA went with Dr. Humes' arrival time of 7:35 as well. And interestingly enough, during the course of their investigation, they interviewed FBI agent Siebert O'Neill, who told both of them told the HSCA that they, in fact, along with Secret Service agents Kelman and Greer, were the ones that brought the casket into the morgue at 7:35. Then we move forward to 1981, where author David Lifton, in his book Best Evidence, stated that President Kennedy's body was delivered to the morgue in a gray shipping casket at 6:45 p.m. And that was according to the Lake County informant, who, as it turns out, was chief of the day of the dental school, Dennis David. In 1990, Harrison Livingstone, in his book High Treason 2, stated that JFK was delivered in the bronze Dallas casket to the morgue at 8 p.m. by the Honor Guard. Finally, in 2008, Doug Horn, in his book Inside the ARB, tells us that the casket arrived at 6:35, received by Dennis David, and his story is corroborated by Marine Captain Roger Boyjan and dental student Donald Rebentish. Now, as you can see, there's a lot of contradictions between the type of the casket, the time of the arrivals, a number of different things that make this somewhat confusing. But the thing that really started me on my journey, and this was in 2016, was the story of Donald Rebentish. As it turns out, when David Lifton's book was released in January of 1981, Time magazine did some kind of a short story reviewing, I'm not sure if it was really a review of the book, but stating some of the salient points that Lifton was making about the fact that the body was put into a bronze casket in Dallas and ended up, according to a witness that Lifton had found, ended up being received at Bethesda in a gray shipping casket. And so, according to Lifton's appraisal of all this, he felt that something nefarious had gone on with the body of the president. When Donald Rementesh is reading Time magazine during a break at work, and he reads this story, he gets a little bit perturbed, to say the least, about the fact that Lifton, is stating that the body had been stolen and put into another casket, and all of that, because it turns out he, in fact, was part of the receiving party that did receive the gray shipping casket at Bethesda that day. And he goes home and tells his, I don't know if it was his wife or his sister, but a relative in his family about this David Lifton account. And he had been telling his story, this is Rementesh, to his family over the years. So they were familiar with it. And it turns out that his relative goes and contacts a local newspaper man, Jerry Morlock, for the Grand Rapids, Michigan newspaper, and saying that her brother Donald had been part of the group of men that received the president's casket at Bethesda that day. Morlock, after doing his due diligence and establishing the fact that Rementesh was at Bethesda at that time, and moreover, because of Rementesh's lead to another witness, Morlock found a man by the name of Richard Muma, who then probably turned Morlock on to another man, Paul Negler. And they in fact corroborate and support Donald Rementesh's account of the events. I think it's important to really understand this, to read to you verbatim the story that was written by Jerry Morlock. And unbeknownst to Rementesh, Morlock sold his story to the wire services. And what I'm going to read to you now is how the story was written on January 25th, 1981, that ran on the UPI. Quote, "The coffin came in through a rear freight entrance 30 to 40 minutes before the bronze casket arrived. Quote, it was a typical navy gray shipping casket, just exactly as we expected. I helped take it out of the hearse, but then somebody else came and took it upstairs. We put it on a gurney and wheeled it in. It was about 4:30 in the afternoon when our chief petty officer came to me and about 5 other petty officers and told us to go to the back of the hospital. Now I'm talking about the loading ramps where they used to bring in supplies. He told all of us that we were going to be there and then we were going to bring the president's casket into the mortuary. We were told not to leave our posts. The chief said we got all the ghouls and reporters and the TV and everybody at the front of the hospital. He said that there would be an empty casket in the ambulance. He said the president's body would really come in the back. We took the casket out and pushed it down a long illuminated hall. Now, this is the service area, not the main part of the hospital." End quote. Now, why is Donald Rementesh's account so important? Well, it turns out what he described to the reporter for the Grand Rapids, Michigan newspaper was a morgue. Was a loading dock and an arrival time that did not correspond at all with Dennis David's account. Now, Dennis David, and he stated this over the years, has told a number of people that the casket that they received at the back of what was actually the new morgue in a brand new wing, Building 8, they had a wooden jetty that was about 40 inches high. and an ambulance or a hearse could back right up into it, which is what happened that night. The black hearse backed up to the wooden jetty. The Secret Service men inside the hearse got out. They removed, actually slid the casket out of the back of the hearse onto the wooden jetty. And then the casket was picked up by Dennis David's men, walked through a set of double doors that led into the hospital. And immediately on the left, about 8 feet up or so, was a door that led into the anteroom, which actually connected to that morgue. And the casket was set down on the floor of the anteroom, and then the men were told to leave. Now, what Rebentesh is talking about is a service area where they delivered the supplies, and this service area had a ramp connected along the side of it, and that's how Rebentesh and the men brought the casket that they received in. And now this is a casket that, according to Rebentesh, arrived 30 to 40 minutes before Jackie Kennedy arrived at the front of the hospital. So splitting the difference a little bit, that would put the casket, the arrival of the hearse, around 6:25, 6:30. As it turned out, I interviewed Donald Rebentesh in 1996 and completely forgot about the particulars of what he told me that day. And after reading the AP, or I should say the UPI story that I found on the internet in 2016, I decided to go back to what he had told me that many years ago. And what Rebentesh said, that he helped remove the shipping casket from the hearse. By the way, to backtrack, the hearse that arrived where he was, along with at least one car filled with Secret Service men, both of these vehicles arrived with their lights off. That was the first unusual thing. When the casket was removed from the hearse, which Rebentesh stated was a 1958 Chevy black hearse, it was put on a gurney, and this gurney was wheeled up a ramp to the level where then there was a door on the right. It was brought into the hospital, and then, according to Paul Nagler in that interview with Morlock, was taken down a long illuminated hallway. Now, long illuminated hallway is a big difference from Dennis David's loading dock. We're going through the double doors, only 8 feet away on the left was the entrance to the anteroom. So we have a number of conflicts here. But the greatest thing that stood out for Rebentesh, and it was an anomaly that I had forgotten about, and then it turned out years later, I had the opportunity to look into it more closely, is the one thing that stuck out in Rebentesh's mind is when they went to the duty station and met with their chief petty officer, he told him and the other men that they would be taking their orders directly from a young Army captain who was there at the time. Now, this was unprecedented in a Navy setting, to be taking orders from an Army captain. But nevertheless, that's what happened that day. Well, I was able to determine years later that young Army captain was named Captain Michael D. Groves. Now, this wasn't just your run-of-the-mill young Army captain. He was head of the White House Honor Guard. He also was the one in charge of the presidential procession, all the events, working underneath General Wheel, of dealing with the procession of the president's casket that whole weekend. So he was a very important person in the mix of things. I think it was about 10 days after the 22nd of November that Captain Groves was having dinner with his wife and his child and dropped dead at the dinner table. No one has ever been able to come to, with a satisfactory answer as to how he died. The official version is he had a heart attack, but he was 28 years old, and according to the men who served under him, was in excellent health. So to say that this is a mystery, to say the least. But in my mind, if Captain Groves is involved with the very first arrival of the president's body at a loading dock that is not Dennis David's, then certainly perhaps that had something to do with the events that happened to Captain Groves later on. For 2 years, I couldn't come to terms or come up with an answer as to where this other loading dock, the Rebentesh and his men are stationed at, is in relation to Bethesda Naval Hospital. I tried to enlist Dennis David's help, Jim Jenkins. I discussed it with William Law, and we just couldn't come up with an answer. We knew that we had 2 loading docks, which were very different from one another. And now, we also know that we have 2 time frames that are different as far as when the casket arrives. But we didn't have any more answers than that. And then through sheer serendipity, in 2018, I came across an interview that was done by researcher Kathy Cunningham with Dr. Robert Carney on April 2nd, 1996. And I'm going to read you something verbatim from that. And it starts out with a very innocuous question by Kathy Cunningham to Dr. Carney. She says, "Do you know where the barber shop was located?" Dr. Carney answers, quote, "There was the new morgue in the new wing, building 8 at that time. The barber shop was across from the old morgue. And that's where they brought the supplies into once they built the new morgue. That's where the Navy's exchange was too. It was the lower level off the main building. It was a separate building." As soon as I heard that Carney had mentioned in the area where they brought the supplies in, that immediately brought me back to the statement that Donald Rebentesh had made to that reporter. Plus the fact he's stating that down from this service area where they brought the supplies in was the old morgue. So Dr. Robert Carney is the only one, and perhaps when we get into a discussion later on, somebody else can fill me in, that I've ever heard discuss regarding Bethesda that there were 2 morgues that existed at that time. Now, we're under the impression the old morgue was no longer in use as of July of 1963. That is when the new wing, Building 8, had opened, and in the basement of Building 8 was a brand new morgue. And in fact, Dr. Carney himself, in August of 1963, in that new morgue, performed the autopsy of Senator Estes Kefauver. But nevertheless, other than mentioning to the HSCA when they interviewed Carney, the fact that his job really that night was to set security at the different entrances, and they had reporters that were running from the old morgue to the new morgue, and he participated in having Marines stop these men inside the hospital. But other than mentioning the old morgue and the new morgue to the HSCA in their interview with him in the 70s, and then to Kathy Cunningham in 1996, I had never heard anybody mention the fact that there actually physically were 2 morgues at Bethesda. So Brooks, the image on the left, is it possible for you to enlarge that a little bit?
You're talking the one that we're looking at right now? Yeah.
And move that over a little bit. So yeah, so to give you an idea of what I'm putting forth here, where you see the number 2, where the tower and Building 1 actually merged with Building 2, in the lower level of Building 2 is actually where Carney stated the old morgue existed, and it was off an annex that ran from Building 4 that you could see in the lower bottom of the image here, and ran all the way across to where 3 and 5 buildings are, and that's where the emergency room was located at Bethesda at that time. Now, where you see Building 4, that is the building, that is where the the area where the service area was, where the supplies were brought in. Now, unlike the wooden jetty that extended out of the double doors outside of the new building 8, where Dennis David had received the shipping casket, building 4 had the kind of entrance where you would back a truck right into the building, and like a garage door, they would open up the door, and then you could carry the supplies right. You're inside the hospital. There was no extended outside loading dock in that area, and that had a ramp, like I said, that ran along the side of it, so that way you could get from the outside into the hospital from that way. So now that we have the existence and the understanding that there were in fact 2 morgues at Bethesda, I'm going to give you what I believe to be the timeline of the events that day. And I'll make it very quick because I'd really like to engage whoever's listening and get any questions or continue the conversation with everybody that's with us today.
Hey, Rick, I've got those 2 slides, old morgue, new morgue. You let me know when you want them up.
Okay, thanks. Around 4:35, 5 o'clock, according to Donald Rebentesh, he's told by his chief petty officer that they would be receiving the body of President Kennedy, and that a decoy ambulance would be arriving at the front of the hospital. Now, around 5:30, Dennis David's brought into his superior's office. This is Chief Ledbetter, and accompanied by a couple of Secret Service agents. Ledbetter informs Dennis David for the first time that the president's body would actually be arriving at Bethesda for autopsy that night. Now, that brings us to 6:30, give or take, approximately. That's when Rebentesh and his men, Paul Nagler, Richard Muma, and another man, Malvin Jones, and they bring the casket into the hospital through the loading area of building 4 to the lower level building 2, where the old morgue is. Now, around 6:30 in the evening, Dennis David gets a call internally from the hospital, inside the hospital, stating that to gather men together for an offload, your visitor's on the way. So between 6:30 and 6:40, Dennis David accumulates some men who were there at the wooden jetty, arriving what turns out to be the black hearse, and then at 6:45 they bring the body into the anteroom and leave it on the floor. Now, I made a mistake by saying they bring the body in, because I believe what happened was, once Rebentesh's casket is brought to building number 2, the lower level where the old morgue is, Kennedy's body is removed from that casket, brought back out to the black hearse, which drives around to the rear, and then is received by Dennis David and his men. And I believe that the casket, the gray shipping casket, which they put on the floor of the anteroom, is empty. Now let's go back to the old morgue. Once the casket is brought in, and this is witnessed by Ed Reed, who comes back from dinner, and he sees the casket in the hallway outside the double doors of the old morgue. And it's being guarded by Marines. I believe these are Roger Boyjan's Marines, and the time that they give Boyjan of 7:35 pertains to the casket that was actually delivered to the old morgue. Interestingly enough, Boyjan told Doug Horn, when Horn connected with him for the AARB, said that he couldn't quite reconcile the fact that he had no memory of seeing the casket himself, and yet he has a time of 6:35 being in his report. And I think that the fact that this casket was actually delivered and witnessed by Boyjan's Marines at the old morgue might explain why Boyjan never saw it himself. So when this body is put on the table at the old morgue right around 6:35, this brings in 2 men that have always been a mystery to researchers. and that is the stories of Robert Knudsen and William Pitzer. Now, Robert Knudsen, as Brooks had mentioned, worked directly under Tazewell Shepard, who was JFK's naval aide at the White House. So it shouldn't be a real mystery as to why Knudsen was there in that capacity, especially the fact that when you listen to the Air Force One transmissions and you have General Clifton and Admiral Berkeley in the process of arranging with General Heaton at Walter Reed Hospital that the president's body is going to be brought to Walter Reed for autopsy, only to have the White House Situation Room contact them on Air Force One and tell them that arrangements had already been made by the president's naval aide, Tazewell Shepard. And so that relationship of Shepard and Knudsen, I think, plays an important part in this. So the interesting thing is that Knudsen's images, and I believe even though Andy Purdy from the HSCA, when he interviewed Knudsen, never asked him, did you take the photographs yourself? And Knudsen said that he had developed the pictures himself that were given, the film that was given to him by Berkeley early that morning, the next day. But that he was away from his family for 3 days. And Purdy never asked Knudsen, well, what did you do the rest of that time? You know, so I'm not sure if Mr. Purdy deliberately dodged asking those specific questions, but nevertheless, I believe Knudsen was the one that took the photographs of what was a pre-examination of President Kennedy's body in the old morgue between 6:35 and most likely 7:45 that evening. And the interesting thing about the Knudsen story and the Pitzer story is Knudsen's images were seen a short time afterward at the White House by Joe O'Donnell when Knudsen showed these photos to him. And O'Donnell told the AARB that there was a definitive entrance wound above the right eye and the forehead and a large blowout in the back of the head. And Dennis David, visiting his friend William Pitzer a few days after the events of that weekend, witnessed Pitzer working on 16 millimeter film, creating 35 millimeter slides from that film. And the wounds that Dennis David saw in those images were the same wounds as O'Donnell saw from Knudsen, an entrance wound in the right part of the forehead and a large exit wound in the back of the head, which leads me to believe that Knudsen and Pitzer documented immediately, once the body was put on the table, the wounds on the president as seen at Parkland and before anything was done to the body whatsoever. At the end of this process, you've got Ed Reed and Jerry Custer who have taken all their x-rays, and now they're sitting on in the podium as Captain Humes is about ready to take a circular saw. He's pulled back the scalp on the president's head and is ready to take a circular saw to the skull of President Kennedy when Reed and Custer are asked to leave the room. And Reed tells the AARB that was the end of their job that night. They had taken all their x-rays. No Y incision had yet been performed on the body. And then they were told to leave the room. So they, in fact, did not see the removal of what I believe was the president's brain at that time. So I think that these events at the old morgue between 6:35 and 7:45 were not only a pre-examination to find out exactly what bullet evidence or the nature of the wounds and what direction these bullets had struck the president's body, but to remove any evidence that would show what direction these shots were fired. And as we know, most likely a number of them from the front. The other interesting thing about Knudsen's interview with Andy Purdy in the HSCA that pertained to this pre-examination is the fact that Purdy knew that Knudsen had in his possession photographs of a probe that had been put through the front of the president's neck and came out the back. But Purdy didn't actually get that information from Knudsen until he was able to establish, because Knudsen had promised the Secret Service he would never discuss it. And it wasn't until the HSCA contacted the Secret Service General Counsel, Mr. Goff, that Knudsen was made confident enough to discuss what he witnessed, which was a probe put through the front of the neck and out the back of the neck. So I think that's important, because that shows that right there, that pre-examination, they knew a shot had struck the president, not only in the front of the throat, but that it exited the back of his neck. And yet, at the formal autopsy later on that evening, we're told that Humes was not allowed to dissect the neck or touch the neck in any way, according to Admiral Berkeley. So what I believe is they already knew what the situation was with the throat wound in the pre-examination, and that's why they told Humes not to go near it later on at the official autopsy. So now this is speculation on my part, but around 7:45, this is when the body had to go from the old morgue back to the new morgue in the basement of Building 8, and most likely that's when it was put in the body bag with a sheet covering that on a gurney and wheeled through the hospital to the new wing of Building 8 in the basement, where it's then reunited with this gray shipping casket that had been sitting on the floor of the anteroom. And I can never reconcile when I heard the story of Dennis David saying that when he and his men had received the casket at 6:45, that they just left it on the floor of the anteroom and left. They didn't even make the effort to go an extra few feet and bring it into the morgue at that point. And that was one of my greatest regrets when I had the opportunity to be with Dennis in 2016, that I never asked him that question. Who told you to have your men leave the casket on the floor of the anteroom? But nevertheless, that casket never officially enters the morgue, according to Paul Connor, who logged it in the book, until 8 o'clock. So you've got a difference of 6:45 to 8 p.m. where, for lack of any other understanding, the gray shipping casket is just sitting there on the floor of the anteroom. So now you have the official autopsy starting at 8 o'clock and everything that was witnessed by O'Connor, Jenkins, and told to us through interviews with Humes, Boswell, and Fink. But there's one other event that is about to take place around the same time at 8 p.m. And that involves the honor guard. Now, the honor guard had arrived maybe 15 minutes before Jackie Kennedy and the Gray Navy ambulance drove up to the front of Bethesda from Andrews Air Force Base. And their job was, once Jackie and Bobby went into the hospital, to then do the same thing that they were supposed to do at Andrews, which is receive the casket. Now, I don't know if they had been told that they would be taking the casket out of the Gray Navy ambulance, bringing it up the steps of Bethesda and through the front door, but nevertheless, they were there to receive the casket in the Gray Navy ambulance. But as they moved upon the vehicle, all of a sudden, it drives away. And they're left standing there, not knowing what to do. Now, before we go further with the honor guard, one interesting sidebar to this is when Dennis David, once his men received the shipping casket, leave it in the anteroom, he then goes up toward the front of the hospital, and he's actually on the upper level of the lobby on the second floor, and he could see through the large glass windows the arrival of the Navy ambulance with Jackie Kennedy. And who does he see get out of the driver's seat? Admiral Galloway. Now, how can this be if William Greer was the one that drove this ambulance away from Air Force One at Andrews? Now, one could say that Dennis David was confused, and maybe he missaw what he stated years later. But interestingly enough, the following day in the Washington Post, one of their reporters who was in front of the hospital stated that he saw Admiral Galloway get in the driver's seat and drive the ambulance away. So here we have evidence of two decoy Navy ambulances. What part that whole situation plays, I'm not quite sure, but nevertheless, the Honor Guard now spend the next 45 minutes trying to find this Navy ambulance and most likely, meet it where with the casket supposed to be brought into the hospital. Finally, at 8 p.m., they catch up with the Navy ambulance, and it's only accompanied by General Godfrey McHugh. You get the bronze casket in the back, no Secret Service, no Godfrey McHugh. I'm sorry, no General Galloway, Admiral Galloway. And this ambulance is parked not in the back of Building 8 where the new morgue is, but in the same area that Donald Rebentesh received the gray shipping casket an hour and a half earlier outside of Building 4. The Honor Guard, according to a very detailed account by Hugh Clark and William Law's book, states that they actually carried the bronze casket up the same ramp that Rebentesh and his guys had pushed the gurney with the shipping casket. They carried the bronze casket up the same ramp on the right through the door into the hospital, where it's put on a church truck or a gurney and wheeled to what is the old morgue. Now, as insane as this sounds, we have two separate events happening now after 8 o'clock. We have the president's body at, quote, the official autopsy at the new morgue in the back of Building 8, the new wing. And we have the Honor Guard bringing this bronze casket to the front of the double doors of the old morgue in the lower level of Building 2. Now, the only people that actually bring this wheel this casket, the bronze casket, into the old morgue at that point is Lieutenant Byrd and James Felder. Everyone else is told to stay out in the hallway and provide security, which is interesting in itself, because why wasn't there already security provided if this is the morgue where the president is being autopsied? So this casket is now brought into the old morgue, and the body that's put on the table and that is autopsied, the wounds on this body are drastically different than the wounds on President Kennedy. The wounds on the body that the Honor Guard bring in the bronze casket have a large wound on the right top of the head into the face. And this is according to Captain David Osborne, according to Richard Lipsey, and also told to me by James Felder. Now, people saw the size of the president's wound on the head, whether it be Parkland or even later on at the Bethesda autopsy, as a large wound in the very rear of the head, but nobody ever described an exit wound or a blowout or damage to the right top front of the head or into the face, even though we see that in certain quote unquote official autopsy photographs. So what we have now are two bodies, two morgues, and two autopsies going on between 8 o'clock and then finally when the bodies are removed around 3 or 4 a.m. Now there's one more contradiction here, and I don't even know what to do with this. I could just present to you the information that exists, and we can have a conversation with about this afterward. The Honor Guard, when the president's body was finally, or I should say, actually, the body that they were dealing with in the old morgue was put back into a brand new African mahogany casket. This casket, according to the after action report written by Sam Byrd, weighed 800 pounds. According to Hugh Clark, by the time the body was in it, it was around 1,000 pounds. Now, luckily enough, they were able to, this casket was on some kind of a church truck and they were able to wheel it from the morgue, and this is the old morgue now, back to where they brought it in, down the ramp, and to the rear of a waiting gray Navy ambulance. However, when they went to lift this casket and put it into the back of the ambulance, they realized immediately that it was much heavier than the bronze casket that they had carried that had arrived from Dallas, which was probably around 400 to 600 pounds. So it was that point that they made the decision for the rest of that weekend to add 2 more men to the group of 6 that comprised the honor guard that were handling the casket that weekend. So we have a 1,000, according to you, Clark, and others, we have a casket that weighs 1,000 pounds. But now let's go to the Gallers after report that they wrote up. According to Joe Hagan, who wrote the report, he stated that Roy Kellerman of the Secret Service demanded that it was his Secret Service men who removed the casket that they put the President Kennedy's body in from the morgue into the ambulance at the back of the hospital. And that casket that was purchased at Gallers weighed 255 pounds. This was a Marcellus 710. So even with the body in it, weighs maybe a little, under 400 pounds. That's quite a difference between 1,000 pounds and 400 pounds, to say the least. So now we have 2 different caskets from 2 different areas of the hospital being loaded into gray ambulances. Now, one more thing that I'd like to address, and then we can get into any kind of questions you might have or discuss this further, is the actual autopsy photographs, or what we're told the autopsy photographs. In my estimation, we have 3 sets of autopsy photographs that are taken. We have the photographs taken by Robert Knudsen that show an entrance wound above the right eye and a large blowout in the back of the head, which he developed in Anacostia and made copies of for Bobby Kennedy and others that he delivered to Admiral Berkeley and to Tazewell Shepard at the White House the following day. Then we have the photographs that are taken officially at President Kennedy's quote unquote official autopsy by John Stringer of Floyd Reeby, which we've never seen to this day, in my estimation. And then we have the photographs taken by Secret Service photographer, Agent James Fox, that, as it turns out, come into the public domain through researcher Mark Crouch, again, through sheer serendipity, because these photographs were never supposed to be seen in the public domain, and access to the photographs of the archives were limited and controlled by the Kennedy family and their lawyer, Burke Marshall, and were only to be seen by official government investigations. And as we know, Robert Groden was able to remove a copy, maybe 4 or 5 of the photographs the HSCA had in their hands. So we know from the Fox photographs, and as Brooks mentioned earlier, that we have a major discrepancy in what we see in these photographs. Number one, the photographs of the profile of the body and also the very rear of the body show the head in a metal circular headrest that's connected to the table. And the men who worked in the official morgue at Bethesda, Paul O'Connor, Jim Jenkins, and others, stated that headrest never existed. That table never had a metal headrest on it. As Brooks mentioned, we also have in the I believe it's the left profile photograph of the body on the table, we see a phone on the wall in the rear of the photograph, which again didn't exist in that part of the room in the official morgue at Bethesda, and also the tile on the stair of death photograph on the floor was not at all the tile that Floyd Reeby and Jim Jenkins remembered during their 1990 gathering by Harry Livingstone in Dallas. When looking at the photographs, Reeby blurred out, "We had a white stone tile in the morgue, not the tile that's in this photograph," and Jenkins concurred at that time. So we have these 3 discrepancies that exist in these photographs. Now, no photographs of the Bethesda morgue in any context of any other autopsy and any other person has ever surfaced, at least publicly, that people in the research community can make a comparison for themselves and decide whether or not Fox's photographs were taken somewhere other than the Bethesda morgue, or in fact, if these are photographs taken in the Bethesda morgue. That has never been made available to us. However, conversely, what if we had photographs of this other room that Fox took photographs of a body on the table, which was not the Bethesda morgue, that we could prove actually existed on the Bethesda campus? In 1996, I think, the AARB interviewed John Stringer. At the very end of his interview with Jeremy Gunn, Stringer just volunteered the fact that he, in fact, had taken the autopsy pictures of William Bruce Pitzer. So now we know that photographs were taken at Pitzer's autopsy somewhere on the Bethesda campus. I believe it was done off book in the very same room that Fox took his photographs of a body that was not President Kennedy's. In 1992, when I gathered the men together in Pittsburgh, and Jenkins, O'Connor, Reeby, Custer are all looking at these photographs, all of a sudden Dennis David, who had never been in the autopsy room and witnessed that night, looked at the photograph, and while they're discussing a metal headrest that never existed in the Bethesda morgue table, Dennis David pipes up and says, "That looks like the table at NAMRI." Well, NAMRI turns out to be Naval Medical Research Institute. It was a building that was on the hill behind the very rear of Bethesda Naval Hospital, about 100 yards up behind the building. Now, I believe that is where Fox took photographs of a body that wasn't President Kennedy. And I happened to see at least 2 of the autopsy pictures that Stringer took of Bill Pitzer. The phone is on the wall as we, in the Pitzer photograph, is in the Fox photograph. The floor tile is identical. And the metal headrest, although Pitzer's head is not on the metal headrest, the metal headrest is swung all the way around, so it's extending out the back of the table, because Pitzer's head is actually on a chalk block, which is what all people who do autopsies do. They put their head on a chalk block, not on a circular metal headrest. So we actually have photographs of Pitzer's autopsy in a room that matches all the details exactly to the room that Fox took his pictures. So one more bit of speculation, and then we can get into any questions you have. This second body, where did it come from? Well, we have the story that also comes from Secret Service James Fox to Mark Crouch. And that is that late afternoon, Crouch is called into the office of his superior, Robert Bauck, and told that they are going to meet a plane coming from Dallas, carrying the body of a dead Secret Service agent. And Fox went to the degree of explaining to Crouch, this was not the president's body. This was one of our own, one of our Secret Service agents. My speculation is the second body that was flown into Washington was received by James Fox and other men that were assembled to perform this task. It was brought to NAMRI. Within this body was photographed on the table that existed in that room at the Naval Medical Research Institute to more or less represent the body of the president. And I believe that even then, when the autopsy after 8 o'clock in the old morgue, witnessed by Lipsy and others, was the body that was going to be a template that would show shots that were fired from behind, not from the front. So regardless of what the president's body told at the end of the day, even though, you know, the brain and the wounds were maybe expanded or altered in the pre-examination earlier in the evening, they had a second body photographed and x-rayed that could represent a gunman firing shots from the behind that would kill the president. And I think that's what this second body was supposed to achieve that night in a very fluid situation. But I personally believe that every photograph that we're told is an autopsy photograph of President Kennedy is not President Kennedy at all. It is his second body. And anybody who has questions about that, I'll be happy to answer as to why I believe that to be the case. So I think that summarizes things in a nutshell. I'm happy to support anything that I just shared with you with the evidence that I found over the last 8 years.
Well, thank you, Rick.
Hey, Rick, Neil, let me jump in real quick on that last comment on the second body. Rick, you could talk about Tom Wilson's analysis of all of this, looking at some of these photos and whatnot that would support what you're saying. The other thing, you had a slide in Dallas that you did a few months ago that I don't have, but you can talk about that. But it's the very same image. And yes, it's taken from the near ear in the image is the left ear.
Thanks, Brooke, for bringing that up. I forgot to mention that. And this is one of the things that brought it home for me about the Fox photograph, the bodies in the Fox photograph, and the fact that I felt it was from President Kennedy, is that in the left profile photograph, that's the one where you see the phone on the wall. You can clearly see the left ear on that body. And in the 60s, other than fingerprints, I think one of the best ways that they would use to identify a body would be the ear, because everybody's ear is supposed to be unique. What I did was I took a photograph of President Kennedy speaking at Fort Worth, a left profile shot of him, inverted it and put it side by side with the body on the table in the Fox photograph. And with this ear comparison, you could see it's definitely not the same ear. It's not even close in my estimation. And so that was one of the things that supported the fact that this is a different body altogether. In the right profile color photograph that Groden, you know, brought out of the HSCA, Tom Wilson, in doing image processing of this photograph, was able to determine. Now, again, this is a body that is yet to receive a Y incision. So in essence, it has not been autopsied yet. And Tom Wilson was able to determine through software that he had that you have mortician's wax covering the entire face, the right ear, into the top of the forehead and the right temple area. So that was always a mystery to Tom as to how can this body have mortician's wax on it when it hasn't even been autopsied yet? Tom didn't know, because he passed away 24 years ago. He had no idea of the research that and the information that I've been able to come up with in the past few years. He just saw this as a tremendous anomaly regarding that particular photograph. And then you've got the only other photograph that we get a sense of Kennedy's face besides the left profile and the right profile is a stare death photograph. Now, the face itself, I believe, is President Kennedy's, probably taken in the late 50s. But if you look closely and you adjust the contrast and the sharpness of that photograph, I believe that's a facial overlay on this other body. You have Kennedy's face and you can see clearly underneath the chin, you know, right from the ear all the way to the other ear, there's a clear line that can be discerned that, in my opinion, is overlaying a photograph of President Kennedy's face on this other body. And you can also determine that by the fact that I'm told, for the most part, physically, you can draw a line from the bottom of your nose across to where your ears are, left or right. In that photograph, the I guess it would be the right ear on that body is much, much lower than it should be physically, if in fact that was truly the president's head. Just another anomaly, but something that in my mind points out to the fact that we're dealing again with some kind of a lie, some subterfuge of the evidence, and that we're told that this is the president when in essence it isn't.
Hey, Rick, you want to talk real quick about those slides, new morgue, old morgue?
The slides are up now?
This,
no, okay. This is actually an interesting story. Thanks for bringing that up, Brooks. This is a very interesting story. Here you are, very detailed. You know, most of the people have seen the drawing, very simplistic, by Paul Connor of the morgue as it existed in 1963. But this is a drawing by Jim Jenkins, much more detailed, of what was the new morgue in the basement of Building 8. And as you could see on the other side of that door there on the left, that's the anteroom where you could see the cold boxes. And you have the cabinets where they are here. You've seen the pictures, and then that where Brooks talked about, that room in the back where was a dressing area, slides were dealt with. I think they had a laundry room there as well. And that was the layout as it existed in the new morgue in Building 8. Now we go to the other image. This is an image that was drawn by Skip Rydberg for William Law. William had interviewed Rydberg for his book In the Eye of History, and William had asked Rydberg, can you do a drawing for me, a detailed drawing of the morgue, because nobody's ever seen a photograph or an image of it. At that point, they just had the O'Connor sketch, if you may. And Rydberg did this detailed drawing for William Law, and William was all excited and was ready to put it in his book, but he first ran it by Jenkins and O'Connor, and they told Law, no, this isn't representation of the morgue that we worked in at all. You've got on the left here the cold boxes inside the room. That wasn't the case. They were outside the room in the anteroom. The cabinets were in the wrong place. A number of different things exist in this drawing by Rydberg that were not in the room that Jenkins and O'Connor had worked in. So William Law never put it in the book. Well, then in 2018, I meet up with Jim Jenkins and William Law in Dallas, and I lay out for them everything that I've uncovered, the Reverend Test story, the Carney story about the two morgues. And for them, the light switch kind of goes off as well. And they start to think in terms of expanding our understanding of the events and what happened in Bethesda that night. Unbeknownst to me, a short time after that, Jim Jenkins on his own goes and pays William Lipsey a visit in Louisiana and brings his sketch of the morgue, which we saw just a few seconds ago, and this sketch done by Rydberg. Lipsey picks the Rydberg sketch, is what he remembered. Why is that important? Because now we actually have an understanding of what the old morgue looked like. And the cold boxes being inside this room was corroborated to me by none other than Dr. Robert Carney. When I interviewed him and I asked him where the cold boxes were, he said in the old morgue, the cold boxes were in the room. In the new morgue, they were outside in the anteroom. So that's just one example of the differences of these two morgues. The other major difference that existed was the fact that in the old morgue, and this is described by Richard Lipsey in his interview with the HSCA, which to me establishes the fact that everything that Lipsey witnessed that night was of this other body at the old morgue after 8 o'clock, is the fact that Lipsey said that he went and sat down in a chair on the podium, which is in the gallery off to the right. And James Felder also told me that, in fact, that podium, that gallery area had chairs, had seating. He described it to me like theater seating. Well, the gallery at the new morgue where President Kennedy was autopsied were bleacher seats, no chairs at all. So that was two major differences between the old morgue and the new morgue, and really helped me get to the point where I felt confident in stating that, yes, we did have these two rooms that existed inside the hospital and were functioning, at least for that evening, as two different events altogether. So I guess to summarize is, in the old morgue in Building 2, we have a pre-examination of the president's body between 6:35 and 7:45. Then we have a new morgue that receives the body of the president, and that's where the official autopsy takes place after 8 o'clock in the basement of Building 8. Then going back to the old morgue after 8 o'clock, we have the honor guard bringing the bronze casket in with this second body, and that's being autopsied by, I believe, one of the participants was Captain David Osborne, who stated to a researcher, Joanne Braun, in the early 90s, that he was the one that cut open the skull cap of the body and removed the brain. And then he actually then replaced the skull cap at the end of the night so the body could actually have an open casket. So you've got Osborne saying that he removed the skull cap and removed a brain, when in essence, Humes, in his autopsy with President Kennedy, stated there was no craniotomy done. There was no need because the wound was so large, the brain, quote unquote, fell out into his hands. So again, that to me establishes Osborne participating in this event, and the description of the brain removed from the head during this event at the old morgue with this other body is also described in Lipsy's interview with the HSCA. So we have those events, and add on to that the photographs taken at NAMRI earlier in the evening. In my opinion, provides us with 4 distinctive events that took place that night at the Bethesda campus.
If I can, Rick, I knew where you were going. I didn't know, we had discussed a lot of this stuff over the last 2 weeks, but I've got a slide, and this probably needs to be maybe updated a little bit, but anyway, we've got 2 ambulances, 1 a decoy, and we've got a black hearse. We have an advance meeting at Andrews to discuss the plan. Kennedy's body is taken to the rear of the hospital while the other ambulance with Jackie arrives at the front. There are 3 caskets: Dallas bronze casket, the plain gray shipping casket, and the wood casket with the Air Force officer. 2 brains as confirmed by the ARB. 2 different exams. Was the brain brought to Bethesda or removed from another body? Jenkins' observations of the brain said it looked like it was a little bit smaller than he would have thought, and it looked like it had kind of been out of the body for a while. We have 2 morgues. We have 2 bodies. We now know that by all the detail you just shared. And a second body was photoshopped to look like Kennedy. This reminded me of what they did with Oswald with the backyard photo at Neely, right? Basically put the face on the body. And we have 2 undertakers. We have Gallers, and supposedly Pumphrey is the name of the firm. Not going to go out on a limb like that, but that's a name that we've heard. We can't validate that. But what could be added into all of this, and if you watch the episode in The Men Who Killed Kennedy on Liggett, like Knutson, he disappeared for for quite a while over that weekend. And it makes me wonder if the dead Secret Service man, who perhaps was a donor body, flown to Washington, maybe introduced into this whole storyline, did Liggett come to Washington, and was Liggett the one who was doing the alterations? Is Liggett the one who put the wax on the face that is seen by Tom Wilson? So I've just got a few bullet points here. We're going to have to work on this and thread this narrative more, but there's just a lot of stuff to think about here.
Well, I'm sure our audience have a few questions anyway after what we've thrown in their lap. So perhaps we could go to some of the people that are listening in and see what they have to to say.
Yep, this is the last slide, so have at it, guys.
All right. Well, that was absolutely fantastic, Rick. Very complicated. So, can I just clarify the 4 events that you're referring to? So, you've got a pre-examination happening in the old morgue. From your perspective, is there anything nefarious going on with the pre-examination? And in addition to that, I think, have you got 2 autopsies running concurrently after 8 o'clock? One in the new morgue and one in the old morgue with a different body. And the 4th event that you mentioned was the at Namri, which was photoshopped. You said that occurred much earlier. Can you just clarify what time you think that happened? So there's a few questions there just to kick off.
Neil, can I jump in on one item here? It's very, very important.
Yep.
Jim Jenkins has always been on the record that he never left the morgue at all from the time he got there in the middle of the afternoon until the next morning, with the exception of leaving to go eat a sandwich. Paul O'Connor was told by Stover at one point, Captain Stover, time to eat your lunch, go eat a sandwich. So O'Connor validates the same story that Jenkins does. The sandwiches were in the back room in the morgue proper, so they didn't have to go outside of the morgue. They just went back to an area back there. There was a table probably with a bunch of food set up, and they ate back there. I asked Jenkins, I stood up in the Old Red Museum at an event that Cyril Wecht was having several years ago. And at the end of a presentation, I stood up and William Law was there with Jim, and I asked him, when did you take your sandwich break? Was it at the beginning before things got started and somebody said it's going to be a long night, might as well get something to eat? Or was it at the end when the autopsy was done, morticians are taking over, your work is done for a while, hey, good job, go eat a sandwich? Or was it during the autopsy? He said it was during the autopsy. That's significant because in best evidence, he told Lifton that he left the morgue at the onset of the autopsy, at the very beginning, on an errand. He was escorted by a Secret Service agent, and he went to get a specimen jar. So he leaves the morgue at the very beginning of the autopsy, contradicting everything he's told us over and over again the past 10 years. But I take it back to how your memory evolves, and he only eventually remembers the sandwich story, and he forgets about this errand. But he's on the record telling Lifton that he went on this errand. Now, O'Connor is sent in and out of the morgue repeatedly on errands. So to wrap this up, here's what I think happened. I think they sent Jenkins out of the morgue at the very beginning. The body's on the table. Go get the specimen jar. So he leaves. They wrap the head. In fact, O'Connor tells Lifton he was the one who actually took the wrapping off the head. And that's when he sees that the brain is empty, the skull is empty, there's no brain. Is O'Connor then sent on an errand? So now they're both out of the morgue. Is that when the brain is then reintroduced into the skull because neither O'Connor or Jenkins are there, right? Now the brain is in the skull. When when Jenkins reappears after his errand, he comes in, the brain is in the skull. So he sees a brain. O'Connor never saw a brain. It's a timing difference. That's why Jim always said, we just chalk it up to timing differences. I could never figure that out because I'm saying, Jim, if you never left the morgue, you had to see the same thing that Paul did. But the reality is, and thank you, Neil, for asking me to do this, because when I went back and read best evidence in this process of getting ready, I found that quote, that story that he told the Lifton, and I said, that's it. He left the morgue. He wasn't there. That's when they put the brain back in the skull. It's exactly when it happened.
Mm-hmm.
I'll turn it over to, but that was my epiphany. And I mean, there's a lot of them. Just like Doug Horn was pounding the table after Stringer's deposition because they knew they had him with the two brain exams and the rest of that story. This is my epiphany. I know exactly when the brain was put in the skull. It was when Jenkins went on the errand to go get the specimen jar.
Well, was it Neil that asked the question?
Yep, I'll shut up for a while.
I was just trying to put the whole thing into context, going back to the sort of the top level thing.
Well, I think the purpose of the body arriving and brought to the old morgue at 6:30
Mhm.
was done. And interestingly enough, Harry Livingstone interviewed Donald Rebentish as well. And Rebentish told Harry that the young Army captain that he was taking orders from had actually told him that the body was being brought in for an examination. Didn't use the word autopsy, said examination. But I think the purpose of it was twofold. First, they actually did a job of documenting the wounds as they truly existed on the body, as stated by the Bethesda witnesses, and that we're finding to be in the materials in the hands of Knutson and Pitzer, and witnessed by O'Donnell and Dennis David. These are the true wounds, with an entrance wound in the forehead and an exit, well, and the exit wound in the back of the head. I think at some point, and then I don't believe that the X-rays that we have in the archives today are the X-rays that most likely were taken by Custer and Reed. But nevertheless, they've documented the wounds as they really existed. And then it was at that point, toward the end of this examination, that Humes removes the brain. They may have expanded the throat wound. They certainly used the X-rays to determine where any bullet evidence existed in the body, and did what they could to basically clean the body of any evidence, because by the time it's autopsied officially after 8 o'clock by Humes, Boswell, and participating with Fink, O'Connor and Jenkins both told me, and I'm sure many other researchers, that at the end of the day, they could not determine officially the direction that the shots came from, because they're dealing with one large defect in the back of the head. No definitive entrance wound, or even exit wound for that matter, just a large wound, and so I think that was the purpose of the pre-examination. They did document, for whatever purposes, the way the wounds really were, but then they ended up removing the evidence and creating what ultimately Humes and Boswell dealt with officially after the fact, which were not, you could have even had Michael Bodden and Cyril Wecht being the ones doing the autopsy, but once that body that had been the evidence removed from, they probably wouldn't have been able to determine much more than Humes and Boswell did, to be honest. So that was the agenda there. And of course, you got this second body, which they didn't know how it might be implemented, more than just the photographs, perhaps determining the nature of the wounds officially in this other autopsy, and using that to represent the body of the president. So I think that's in essence what was going on at that time.
So can I just clarify that again, Rick? So the early pre-examination turns into a body alteration scenario, and Humes and Boswell are emphatically bad actors, because they were involved in this and conducting this early pre-examination body alteration, correct?
Correct. In fact, as Doug Horn would say, Humes is almost doing a preemptive strike on himself by bringing up, the very event, by saying it seems there's apparent surgery of the head. He should know. He
did himself as conducted. Okay.
He did it, but I think the difference here is that in David Lifton, and David, with all due respect to David Lifton, he didn't have all the information at that time when he wrote the book, but he's determining something much more nefarious, is the fact that the body was actually stolen in order to create an alteration to give the autopsy doctors a false impression of where the shots came from, and so forth and so on. I think that what was witnessed at the official autopsy on the body after the fact was just the end result of the evidence being formally removed from the body. And so it wasn't a purposeful, although quite frankly, there was an alteration of the body, that's true, of the wound on the top of the head, because it's clearly photographed by Knutson and filmed by Pitzer, that you could see anybody looking at those materials that there's an entrance wound above the right eye, and yet that wound doesn't exist by the time the body officially arrives after 8 o'clock at the new morgue. So they did obfuscate that. In fact, Jim Jenkins, I think, said that there was a diagonal from the top of the forehead going back. There was a diagonal wound or something that seemed unusual to him, and perhaps nothing natural that had been caused by a bullet wound.
I think he's referring to one of those cuts that those quote unquote tears that made the 4 flaps. The one going to the forehead is actually probably an incision, not a tear. That was an incision. In fact, Humes probably made all those incisions. He might have made them somewhat jagged to make them look like a tear, but that's how they cut through the scalp so they could peel the flaps back so they would have access to the brain. The brain is removed, and then when O'Connor sees it in the new morgue, there's no brain in the skull.
And they had to do it in such a way that it didn't look like an official craniotomy, because that was supposed to take place at the official autopsy. So they're really stepping on the line there with all this. But
just to summarize, Neil, I could create 2 new slides here, but I'm just going to verbalize. So in the old morgue, we've got Knudsen and Pitzer. Knudsen's taking photos and Pitzer's filming, movie camera. In the new morgue, you've got Stringer and Reeby. That's clearly how we separate the people involved in taking images of this. As far as X-rays, Reed and Custer on the new morgue, Reed and Custer in the old morgue early. And Reed says they never saw the Y incision. They were all done with the X-rays before they left. But this is puzzling because the ARB clearly says 3 of the X-rays that are present in the collection are after evisceration. So after the Y incision. I think Custer realized that, and I think Reed's story is true. They took all their X-rays before they ever cut the body open, but yet you've got to account for the X-rays after evisceration. So Reed tries to claim that with the ARB, that's what they did. But what's interesting, Ebersole, who was deceased and the ARB couldn't talk with him, he told the HSCA he took X-rays. So clearly, if Reed and Custer are in the old morgue taking X-rays before evisceration, and they never took any after, but yet there's X-rays of the body, 3 of them after evisceration, and Ebersole told the HCA he took X-rays, did he take the X-rays in the new morgue? Or that's the question mark. Who was taking the X-rays in the new morgue that are in the collection, or were they somehow produced somewhere else? But anyway.
Can I still just go back to this top level, just so for all of us to fully understand here the 4 different events, because I think this is really, really critical. So we have this pre-examination / body alteration event where clearly Humes and Boswell are bad actors. Very briefly, guys, is there anybody else in that room for this pre-examination who are significant to these shenanigans?
Well, I think you have Reed and you have Custer. And if we do believe one aspect of Custer's story, he says that he took the first set of X-rays, went upstairs around the same and sees Jackie Kennedy entering the hospital. That would be around 6:55, 7 o'clock. So if the official autopsy of the president isn't done till 8 o'clock at night, then the only way Custer could have these films is if they were taken at this pre-examination, obviously. But according to the testimony given by from the HSCA to Jan Gale Rudnicki. Now, Rudnicki was not scheduled to be in the morgue that day. He usually worked days. O'Connor and Jenkins worked nights. Now, the HSCA interviewed Rudnicki, and Rudnicki is describing the wounds on the president's head very much like they looked at Parkland. Now, the interesting part of this story is, and this was part of Jim Jenkins' kind of secret investigation that he did unbeknownst to me originally, is the fact that he actually contacted Rudnicki a few years ago, got him on the phone, and started asking him about what Rudnicki did that night. Now, the problem for Rudnicki is he knew that Jenkins knew that Rudnicki was not in the morgue during the official autopsy of the president. And yet, how could Rudnicki be describing the wounds to the HSCA the way he did? And that was one of the reasons why Jenkins had contacted Rudnicki. And Rudnicki told Jenkins, because he knew he couldn't lie to him, that in fact, yes, he was in the morgue during the president's autopsy. He was upstairs working on slide samples. So that led me to believe, especially with Rudnicki's description of the HSCA of the wounds that he saw on the president's head, that Rudnicki assisted Boswell. And maybe that was the truthful part of that whole story, that he supposedly was brought in by Boswell to assist him. Well, I think he probably did assist Boswell. It was just during the pre-examination, not during the official autopsy. So I think you've got Reed, Custer, Rudnicki, Boswell, Humes. Who else was there? I can't tell you. But
do you think Reed and Custer were there for the alteration component of event one, or just for the examination?
Well, according to Reed's AARB interview, just as Humes is about to do damage to the head and has already reflected back the scalp, that's when Reed and Custer are sent out of the room, and they, and Reed tells the AARB, yep, we had taken all our x-rays, so we were through for the day. And then Jeremy Gunn asked Reed, did you ever see the president's body again after that? And Reed says no. So Reed and Custer were not present or witness to what Humes was about to do. But nevertheless, saw the beginning of it because he had that circular saw in his hands.
Okay, all right. Well, that's good enough. So just moving on to the 8 o'clock events. So events, we'll call them 2 and 3. So you've got the official autopsy going on in the new morgue with Jenkins and O'Connor and the cast of thousands and the FBI agents. And at that point, the body's set up for shots from the rear. 2 shots, trajectories, and so forth, etc. That becomes the official narrative for the Warren Commission. But concurrently, you've got this other autopsy going on. Again, if I'm understanding this correctly, you've got this other autopsy going on roughly at the same time in the old morgue again. Is that correct, Rick?
Yes.
And this other autopsy is on another body. And it's either an SS agent or it's the Air Force guy. Is that what you're thinking?
I don't know. To be honest with you, I've never known what to do with the whole Air Force major story. I've just kind of put that aside because we don't have anybody else to corroborate that at all, other than Jim Jenkins being told that that's who was in that casket, late that afternoon. And then that casket disappears. So we don't know what to do with at all with that. But
who are the doctors who are conducting this other, in inverted commas, autopsy in the old morgue concurrently? Who are these?
Well, as I said, I believe one. You have Captain David Osborne.
Yeah.
And his description of dealing with the head wound and the brain and all that leads me to believe that he was one, and he was head of surgery at Bethesda at that time. He enlisted one of his friends, whose name is escaping me right now, and the HSCA interviewed that man as well, and he had very little to say about anything that he said he couldn't remember much. So I apologize for not remembering the name of this second man, but nevertheless, at least those 2 men were involved. And when Kennedy's body was received at the official autopsy, at that point the body couldn't tell the men in the room or the people doing the autopsy what had happened. You couldn't distinguish where the shots came from. Whereas the body that's being dealt with at the old morgue after 8 o'clock has, according to Lipsine, he did a drawing for the HSCA. He actually has 3 wounds. He has a wound in the lower, in the back of the body. He's got a wound right there at the neckline, the hairline, right around where the EOP is. The wound in the back, by the way, they could never find where they tried to trace it and they could never find where that went. The wound in the back of the neck, they have going out through the front of the neck. And then they have a wound on the head, which is just pretty much an in and out, a blowout of the right top of the head into the face, where you can't see a distinctive entrance wound or whatever. It's just a large blowout. So Lipsy is saying that he witnessed and that the doctors in that room determined that the body had been struck from behind by 3 different bullets. So at that,
you've got three bullets from the rear, autopsy going on in the old morgue, and you've got 2 bullets from the rear going on with Fink, Boswell, and Humes in the new morgue.
That's exactly what they were trying to do in the old morgue, was the 3-shot scenario.
Right. Okay. So they're covering. Are you saying, Brooks, they're covering themselves for a 3-shot scenario because it was all set up ex ante for 3 bullets, 3 holes found in the 6th floor, etc. Is that what you're thinking here?
Yeah. And then that got upset by other factors, and particularly
the missed bullet was the problem.
Yeah, once they found out from Dallas, from Perry, that there had been a hole in the throat. But two things real quickly. I think as soon as Hume started to, he'd already retracted the scalp, and he's got this circular saw and starting to cut on the thing. Reed and Custer are sent out, and they never come back. I think immediately at that point, it's probably likely that Humes handed it off to Osborne, because he and Boswell have got to get out of there and get over to the new morgue, right, for those proceedings. I mean, so I think Rick's spot on. I think who better, the chief of surgery, right, to get involved in some of this stuff. So I think that's where Osborne enters the picture.
Right. And sorry, can I just, in the interest of time, just finish off this big picture thing here, please? So then we have this final event, and I wanted to know from Rick, what time did this occur? This was in Namry. It was an another corpse, and it was a Photoshop situation Rick was describing. Is this body likely to be the same body that was being autopsied in the old morgue? And what was the purpose of the shenanigans in Namry? If you could just clarify that, please.
Well, again, it's speculation because we don't have any witnesses to this. But my hypothesis is that when the ambulance left the front of the hospital, leaving the honor guard behind, I believe it then, and because it's driven by Admiral Galloway, who knows the campus inside and out. He's the superior officer for Bethesda. It's his it's his campus. So I believe he drove the ambulance all the way to the back of the hospital, up the hill to where Namry was located. And ultimately, after the body that was received by James Fox and the other Secret Service men, that I believe was brought to Namry from wherever that plane landed, and the photographs were taken, I believe it was that body in the Fox photographs that was put into the bronze casket and then driven back around to the side of the hospital where building 4 was, where that service area was. And that's when the honor guard catches up with it right around 8 o'clock and then brings the casket into the hospital. So I think that's where that other body comes into play. And they needed something to document the wounds according to the scenario that was already in play, which is a gunman firing from a building from behind the president. And regardless of how many shots hit the president's body or how it looked after the fact, they always had this second option to be able to go with, that they could present in the limited fashion that they had to, and then move on. I think they were that arrogant to think that they could pull this off, and they never expected any of these photographic images to ever surface to the point where 60 years later, you've got people like all of us that are analyzing it with a fine-tooth comb. These photographs are never supposed to be seen in the public domain, and so given that, I think they were pretty confident that they could just lie their way through it and nobody would question it.
Hey, Neil, Scott had his hand up for a long time and he took it down, but I don't know. Did you get your question answered, Scott, or did you have one?
Thanks, Brooke. No, I think Neil's follow-up questions have kind of answered some of the things that I had in mind, because some of the stuff that I've never heard before. But maybe if I could ask, the body that I think Rick mentioned earlier, there's a body that we all thought was JFK on a table with a telephone in the background. But is Rick saying that actually isn't a picture of JFK, and that's possibly the Secret Service agent that we heard was shot in Dallas? And what do we know about that Secret Service agent? That's the first I've ever heard that there was an agent shot in Dallas and killed and then flown back to Washington. Can anybody expand on that? And that photograph, that hasn't been photoshopped. That is actually just a different person. Does that make sense?
Well, at least in one of the photos, they had to Photoshop. I think it's just a stare death photograph that they overlaid Kennedy's face on a different body. You only have 3 photographs, period, that even show any aspect of the president's face. As I think we can pretty much establish the left profile, that's the one you mentioned with the phone on the wall. That's another, with the ear comparison, that's definitely somebody that's not Kennedy. And then the right profile, but what you mentioned about the dead Secret Service agent, to me, I always believed, and again, this is pure speculation, trying to figure out, how did the body get from Parkland Hospital to Air Force One? And the story of it being in the casket, bronze casket that's brought into the plane, and then the body removed at some point, and then somehow or other, I don't know how you would then get it into the bottom part of the storage area of the plane, to me was ludicrous. I just couldn't believe that whatsoever. That's why I believe that the body was removed from the bronze casket after everybody thought that, the president was sealed in, and they assumed that was the case. I thought that the dead Secret Service story was put out for the media as a cover as to, if they removed what looked like to be a second body from Parkland after the white hearse leaves to go to Love Field, that they could state that was in fact the dead Secret Service agent. In fact, I believe that it was Aubrey Wright that drove this other body to Love Field and perhaps didn't even know it was the president. He probably was told by the Secret Service, this is one of our agents, you're not to discuss this with anyone, and there's such discrepancy in Wright's official story of the events of that day that he was involved in, that makes one wonder, is there more to his story that meets the eye? So originally, I thought that the dead Secret Service thing was just a cover story to remove Kennedy's body after the fact, if anybody witnessed it. And then, of course, they retracted it later on the day, which would lead you to believe that, well, for whatever reason they put it out, they didn't need it anymore. And now, they said it was wrong, only to have then the Crouch James Fox story, the fact that Fox telling him that there really was a dead or a body that they said was a dead Secret Service agent, that they were asked to meet at the plane. Now, Fox never says what happens after they receive the body, where it goes or anything else. And maybe he was told it was a dead Secret Service agent, when in essence, it was a body that they just had on hand in Dallas that looked enough like the president that, this was all part of a pre-organized plan that they had in place, as crazy as it sounds, but
I just want to add to that real quick. If you read the Price report, which has got all of these after action summaries from all the people at Parkland, Assistant Administrator Steve Landergan says at one point, a couple agents came up to Price, who's the top dog, right? Said, is there another way to get the body out of the hospital so we don't have to deal with the crowds and all of that? And he thought that Price took him down into the tunnel system. But anyway, that's in the Landergan report. So make of that what you will.
Can I ask one quick follow-up, and I'll let the others come in? So that looks like a different body than that profile photograph. But the second autopsy in the old morgue, the bullet, the wounds seem to be very, very almost identical to the wounds that, or similar to the wounds that JFK suffered. So is that just a coincidence that was the case, or was there some planning behind that?
Well, I don't think the wounds on the body at the old morgue really corresponded to Kennedy's wounds, especially Kennedy's body after everything had been done. But it certainly corresponded to the scenario that they were trying to, the agenda that they needed to create, which is a gunman from behind. The mistake they made is having this body receiving 3 wounds and not 2 wounds. So I think that's the only situation. But Kennedy's body was just a mystery. Nobody could really figure out what was going on with that, other than the back wound, which never went anywhere. So the throat wound was never examined. So as far as everybody was concerned, they were just witnessing a tracheotomy that was done at Parkland. So the neck wound at the official autopsy didn't come into play that night. And then you have a large blowout in the back of the head, black top of the head, which looks like a bomb went off. So there's no entrance wound or exit wound, so it is really a difference between the 2 bodies, I think.
Quick comment on the back wound. The actual wound, as witnessed by people, was lower than the wound that Hume supposedly put his little pinky in and tried to probe and whatnot. If Humes could get the tip of his pinky in there, that's a pretty good sized wound. But in the autopsy report, it says that angle of descent into the body was 45 to 60 degrees, and it only went a little bit and stopped at the top of the pleural cavity, and it didn't go any further. I think that was made in the old morgue as part of the alteration. That's a false passage they created because they knew it went nowhere, and they created that so that it could be easily probed. Humes could stick his finger in it, and the reality is it was masking the true trajectory of the bullet going elsewhere. I think that's a fabricated wound myself.
Just one last thing, and just for clarification, the official JFK autopsy took place in the basement of Building 8. Is that right?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. I'll be quiet now.
That's okay. Brooks, as I alluded to yesterday, I'm going to have to leave shortly. I'm sure this thing is going to run and run and run tonight, but can I just get 3 quick questions in, just for the record, and you can answer them very quickly. Who were the Secret Service agents who took the autopsy report to the Parkland doctors? Who were they? The names?
We need to find out. I don't have that.
That's quite telling. That's quite telling, isn't it? Is there an index of everybody that Manchester interviewed? Yes,
it's in the back of his book. Actually, it's in the table that I've created.
Okay, I've got.
Actually, my table doesn't. It's a broad list. A lot of politicos. I mean, he's interviewing, I think, Dean Rusk and McNamara. I mean, it's a big list, but it's in the back.
I mean, everybody he interviewed for his book is listed. Okay, that's cool. And my final question to you is: you claimed that the Mauser bullet was used on Connolly, and yet it's still pristine and it went through his wrist. How do you reconcile that?
I think it was a planted bullet to tie to the Mauser, which obviously everybody who first saw the gun on the 6.4 said it was a Mauser, not a Carcano. They're just planting bullets. I mean, both these bullets are pristine, right? The one at Parkland is pristine, but it's not 399. It's got a point. The one that shows up in evidence, 399, is basically pristine. Those are just planted bullets. Those bullets were never fired through Kennedy or Connolly, but they're trying to tie them to the guns and into the 2 men.
Okay, fair enough. Tony will take over. Before I leave, I just want to thank you both for what's been really good so far. But unfortunately, I have to go. So that's great, guys, and we'll catch up at some point, Brooks.
Okay, sounds good. I'm doing this on 3 hours sleep, so at about 30 minutes, I'm punching out too. So
okay, all right. Well, thanks. I got a dash. Bye.
All right.
Okay. Cheers, Neil. Do we have any other questions? or comments, guys?
Well, go on, Brooks. Your charts of witnesses and this, that, and the other. Did you say that you would or could forward those to DPUK?
Yep, I'll push them all to Neil, and then you guys can have at it.
And he can distribute them. That sounds good to me. Is the do you think the pool of blood that's always been a mystery in Dealey Plaza by the steps on the knoll is and I'm not sure whether that's when the dead Secret Service agent story.
Yeah, there was
Rolls up.
speculation about that. There was supposedly
Yeah.
a young black couple back there at one point, and they dropped the red soda pop. Rick, I don't know if you know what to make of that.
If you'd like, I'll address that.
Sure.
I think that the young black couple, I believe her name was Evelyn King. She came forth, I think sometime in the 90s during one of the anniversaries and told her story of what happened that day. If you know Casey Quinlan, he's got a real handle on that story. But I think that the soda pop and the bench they were sitting on was much closer to where Zapruder and Sitzman were, because Sitzman actually witnessed the couple and heard the soda pop hit the ground. But that's got nothing to do with the blood that was seen by Jerry Coley at the top of the stairs leading up from Elm Street. The only thing that I could determine is that blood could very well have come from Gordon Arnold. Now, for many years, people believe that Gordon Arnold was tucked into that far corner where the fence was, behind the knoll, that's seen in the Mormon photograph where the badge man image is located, just to the rear and to the right of Zapruder. But I was able to determine that in essence, Gordon Arnold was standing right near the top of the steps from Elm Street. He was the one that hit the ground, reacting to a shot that was fired past his left ear from the gunman who was witnessed by Ed Hoffman, and that's at the far other end of the fence in the parking lot. So in essence, Gordon Arnold has hit the ground, and he's right there behind that white retaining wall, right there a few feet from the top of the steps of Elm Street. And when he is confronted by two policemen, for him to give up his film, perhaps he was kicked or something that led him to bleed. That's the only thing I could think of, because he was the only one in that immediate area, when the shots were fired, in my estimation.
I totally agree with that. I think the Black Dog Man in Willis 5 is blotting out where Gordon Arnold is standing.
Right.
Absolutely.
Brooks, how you doing? Quick question. Good. Was the Dallas police in constant contact with the goings on at Bethesda?
It could have been, because the phones were being used throughout the night by a lot of people in the morgue, admirals, generals, a lot of people. I forget who, I just read that testimony the other night, but yeah, the phone was in nonstop use basically. So it's very possible there was some communication going on back with people in Dallas.
Is there anything in the official record that states that the Dallas police were in constant communication with Bethesda?
No, I don't. Rick, I don't know.
I don't know either.
It's just because obviously Fritz signed a complaint for charging Oswald with the murder of President Kennedy. I think it was 11/26 on the 22nd. But of course, the autopsy wasn't even completed by then. So they basically charged Oswald with the president's murder without actually getting the results for the autopsy, which is very bizarre.
Good point.
I believe I read somewhere that Humes had been informed by Berkeley that they already knew they had the gunman. They already knew the shots were fired from behind, and they were just trying to find evidence to support that.
It's just obviously because if Oswald hadn't been killed, this autopsy report, the brain, the dissection of the brain for trajectory of the shot, the wound in the back, that would all have had to have been explained during Oswald's trial. Now, we all know that actually during the autopsy, none of the president's wounds were dissected for track. I think it was it not Fink during the trial of Clay Shaw said he was ordered not to dissect the wound in the neck. So we actually don't know where President Kennedy was shot from because none of the wounds were actually dissected at autopsy.
Well, I think if we believe the story of the materials that were in the hands of Knudsen and Pitzer, there's a definitive entrance wound above the right eye in the top of the forehead, and that's exactly where Admiral Berkeley tells Kilduff, who in turn tells the media that where Kennedy was shot, and he puts his finger right to the top of above his right eye in the forehead. But that's a shot from the front. And then, of course, if you have the Knudsen HSCA account, if we believe that, he's stating that he in fact saw the probe go through the front of the neck and out the back of the neck. So that's another entrance wound from the front. So, at least what's going on in the early part of this pre-examination, we have evidence of two shots from the opposite direction of the gunman they're trying to pin it on. And I'm sure Kennedy was at least struck, if that back wound is correct and it is a true wound, and that's a third shot. And then I believe he was struck in the head at least twice, one above the right ear in the temple and one in the forehead. So,
I mean, isn't it highly irregular to charge somebody with a crime when you actually don't have any of the data from the autopsy?
Not when he's already a patsy and you could lie and cover up the whole thing.
Yeah, but I'm just let's say for argument's sake, this was any other crime. It was a normal crime that had been conducted in Dallas. Wouldn't it have been highly irregular to charge an accused person with a crime when the actual autopsy of the victim hadn't actually concluded yet? Because the Dallas police at that moment wouldn't have known if the autopsy would have jibed with their theory that Oswald or somebody committed all the shooting alone and all the shots that came from behind.
That's a very good point. They did jump the gun a little bit there. If you look at the latest, I did this slide a while back in another presentation, but David Mantic and Doug Horn both have a 3-shot scenario where the president was struck in the head by 3 bullets. They firmly believe that. So, I mean, the brain got it from all directions. Here's an interesting thing about the Belmont memo. There's a bullet in the head behind the ear, and they're getting it now. That all ties to the 6.5 millimeter object on the X-ray. It's a setup for this bullet that's going to be found in the Bethesda morgue. All right. The whole thing is a setup,
Yeah, of course, as well, when Humes destroys his notes on the 24th and he claims that they were stained with the president's blood. But of course, during his deposition to the HSCA years later, Gunn elicits from Humes that he wrote the notes in the privacies of his own sitting room. So how could they have been stained with the president's blood? And of course, this would all have been important evidence at Oswald's trial. But he was murdered before he could get his trial. But what I'm trying to establish here is the Dallas police on the 22nd and 23rd, and all the newspapers New York Times, etc. They were all running with the story that Oswald was the assassin. The Dallas police were coming out with, he is the assassin of President Kennedy. They were making these definitive statements. Yet the autopsy hadn't even begun. And yet they had this guy as the killer. So that to me is just how can that possibly be? And of course, during Air Force One, when the president's body was going back to Washington, it was announced on Air Force One that there was no conspiracy in the death of the president, and that it was committed by one man, and his name was Lee Harvey Oswald. And if you read Pierre Salinger's book With Kennedy, he says that he was on the plane. They had done a conference in Tokyo, or they were in Honolulu, and they were coming back to Washington, and their plane was radioed with the message that Oswald had committed the crime, his backstory, that he had defected to Russia, and that he was a member of the Fair Play for Cuba Committee. This was on the 22nd.
Yeah, I think Oliver Stone covers that in JFK with Mr. X, about how all these news reports are getting out there so early. In fact, I think same situation with Mr. X. The story actually got out in advance almost. It sounds like, how fast they were ready to go with a narrative.
But it's just very interesting that they had Oswald as, they were basically announcing his guilt, and they were saying they had all this proof, etc. And yet the autopsy, they had none of the data from the autopsy. So that's why I was asking if the Dallas police had been in sort of constant contact with Bethesda to try and get information. But yeah. Anyway, thanks.
You've got your hand up. Do you want to comment? Do you have a question?
That me, Tony?
Yeah, Scott, go ahead.
Yeah. I just wondered if Brooks and Rick had a view on the story in the men, or the theory in the men that killed Kennedy, about William Bruce Pitzer being murdered because he was going to retire and maybe release photographs and video evidence, and if they have a view whether Purposely May actually attended the official autopsy.
Yeah, Rick would be the expert on that.
I'm glad you brought that up, because once we discovered that there was an old morgue, and that I believe there was that pre-examination that took place earlier, then we had a place to actually put William Pitzer where he could be shooting film, and he could have these materials that were witnessed a few days later by Dennis David. And a lot of people dismissed Pitzer's story entirely, including David Lifton, because they had no witnesses who saw him in the room. But in essence, he wasn't at the official autopsy. He was at this pre-examination. Now, I believe, his wife and sons believe that Pitzer was murdered. She went along to get along with the whole Navy's version of events because she wanted to keep her husband's Navy pension. So she never really caused much of a fuss, although she was actually disconnected from at least her younger son over the years over this whole matter. I think he was very upset the fact that she didn't question, the fact that her husband had actually been murdered rather than commit suicide. Nobody in the family believed suicide. But what's interesting in the room is when they discovered the body, right next to it was a ladder, step ladder. And above the ladder was a ceiling tile that had been moved, leading one to believe that there was something hidden in the ceiling that had been removed by the person who I believe had shot and killed Pitzer. And the FBI, interestingly enough, got involved and did a 200-page report on this death. Why is the FBI getting involved with something that's a suicide? So there's a lot of things. And then, of course, the whole story of Dan Marvin that surfaced, and him saying that he originally was asked to perform this assassination on Pitzer. And I met with Dan Marvin. In fact, that whole segment of The Men Who Killed Kennedy was a segment that I was involved with producing, that I brought Dan Marvin into it, and Dennis David and the whole Pitzer story, because I fully believe that there was something tremendously suspicious about the death of Pitzer. We just couldn't figure out why would they have killed him. And first of all, you have to accept the fact that he had these materials in his possession that, as it turns out, as Brooks mentioned, the very day or the day afterward had been formally given by Bobby Kennedy to the National Archives in a deed of gift. So how can you have fake photographs given to the archives exist? And then, of course, what might have been in the hands of Pitzer, which showed the true nature of the wounds on the president's body. That was obviously a very scary issue for certain people. They wanted to make sure Pitzer would never go public or have the ability to do so.
Okay, can I bring Gary in? As Pete, I know you got your hand up. I will come to you, but Gary has put his hand up earlier on. So go ahead, Gary, and then I'll come to you, Pete.
Yeah, thank you very much for a totally enlightening presentation. I mistakenly tried to put something in the chat earlier. I thought we were storing questions there, so excuse the interruption at the time. But my question concerns Sean Fetter's new book, or books, Under Cover of Night, the U.S. Air Force involvement in the assassination. And have you guys had any chance to look at his research?
Yeah, Kellerman beating the head, you know, to a pulp. I'll let Rick comment on that.
Yeah.
Well, I actually purchased both volumes, and actually, you know, with no disrespect to Mr. Fetter, I did take Case Closed and the Bugliosi book and replaced them as doorstops with the 2 Fetter volumes. I'm joking, obviously, but the thing that struck me is once, you know, Mr. Fetter says that Roy Kellerman on Air Force One took a small axe to the back of the president's head. You know, I couldn't really take anything that was going on seriously. And as it turned out, Doug Horn did us all a service by writing a very extensive review on the books on Amazon. So I guess if anybody wants to have a summary of what's in those 2 volumes, just read the Doug Horn review on that.
Yeah, I read the review. Horn was, you know, only doing a critique of the medical evidence. But I think, having read the first volume, the 500 pages, I haven't ordered the second one. It's a little steep at $45. But I would say that there's a large amount of his research that complements yours. What's new with you guys is the second autopsy, or the second morgue on site. That's brilliant. Fetter talks a lot about the secret. He doesn't, in the first volume, he's not talking about the Secret Service agent as an agent. He's saying there were 2 murders in Dallas, and then he goes into the process of the body moving to Love Field, and his whole shtick is to try and tease out the movement of the 2 bodies on the various aircraft that were present at Love Field. And the point is, he interviews 50 Air Force people that were never interviewed before, including the ones on the plane. And yeah, I agree that the Kellerman thing is really over the top, but he has one of the pilots on Air Force One describe Kellerman having blood from his neck down, coming into the cockpit, and then saying, or somebody volunteering another white shirt that he could replace the one that's all bloodied, and then verifies that in fact there are white shirts on the plane, for people to have a replacement in case they spill food or whatever. So there's a lot of stuff there that I think you guys would agree with. You know, a lot of the problem with the first volume, and maybe the second too, is that he is so adamant that he has solved the crime, and everybody else is full of it. So if you can get past that, there's real gems in there that I think complement your
Well,
scenario.
the other thing in the books I heard people, criticize it for is the fact that there are no definitive notes that correspond to any of the things that he's putting forth. I think he just puts out something like, and everything he puts out, it's like as told to the author or something to that degree, and there's nothing definitive as to exactly where this source material came from or that source material. It's all, as told to the author or the authors, so he's kind of cagey in the way that he presents the information. And that's one of the reasons why I was questioning it. I hope some of it's true, but I just don't know.
Well, he has a lot of footnotes that are, as you described, but also ones that are more precise. And of course, the index doesn't exist in the first volume. It's at the end of the second, along with the appendixes and so on. But, and the other thing is he just rips Lifton through the whole book, or through the first volume, which is interesting. He just says that Lifton made some key mistakes in terms of how the body was handled. And anyway, I'll leave it at that. But I just think
I just want to say, Gary, that none of us would be here working on this without David Lifton. I mean, what he did and his research and effort to produce best evidence is we've built from there,
Well, I agree. I agree. And he was one of two main researchers for Lifton. And so he would say the same thing, but at some point they had a falling out. And so he's picking the bones, excuse the pun, to get back on his track, I guess.
The one thing I found confusing in that is the fact that, and I couldn't understand why Fetter continually was attacking Lifton. It was really almost like a personal vendetta. But I remember, if I'm correct, that Fetter did a radio interview, or perhaps it was in print somewhere, that he began researching this subject in 1983. And perhaps during that time after that, he had worked as a researcher for Lifton. But Lifton's book came out in 1981, 2 years before Mr. Fetter supposedly got into this for the first time. So, there's a lot of contradiction going on here that I don't know the whole story personally, but it just seems a little bit odd.
Yeah,
Okay,
I just recommend to give it a chance, get past his bravado. And, I don't know what the second volume says. I spent 2 hours on the phone with him, and he's this is a month ago. He had a phone number that you could get to him through right online. So I let him talk for 2 hours. He's a ex journalist, broadcaster, has that kind of voice, and is very, very convincing. And it seems like he's got an answer for everything. But the brilliance of his analysis is about the movement of the body and the two bodies between, and it's very convoluted, but I'd say between 2 or 3 of the planes sitting at Love Field that other parts of the entourage were using. And so when you guys talk about, I think you mentioned a second plane. So that there's a lot of convergence between your scenarios and his. I would doubt, although I haven't read the second volume, I doubt that at this point he's aware of 2 morgues at the hospital, and that may change a lot of his ultimate conclusion. Anyway, I'll stop there.
Thanks, Gary. Okay, I'm just going to think about wrapping it up, guys. We're coming up close to 4 hours. It's been a terrific discussion, though. I'm going to come to you, Pete, and then we'll come to Johnny, and then we'll wrap up. So go ahead, Pete.
Yeah, to Brooks. You mentioned, and there may be a number of back wounds, but you mentioned that that one was faked. I was interested the first time I've come across what you mentioned about Diana Boron, stating that the back wound that she saw at Parkland was smaller than the throat wound.
Yeah, that was her perception.
Yeah. Well, that's interesting in that Malcolm Perry, I got a statement of his that the throat wound that he worked on was between 3 and 5 millimeters in diameter. So if whatever Boron thought was smaller than that's interesting. But the kicker for me for the back wound is Kennedy's clothing, in that the holes in Kennedy's jacket and his shirt matched up, and was 5 3/4 inches below the collar of the shirt and 5 1/2 inches below the collar of the jacket.
Mm-hmm. Can I speak to that?
Yeah.
Okay. Hypothetically, let's say he's shot from the front in the neck. The neck x-rays have disappeared. What if it clipped a vertebrae and fractured a small fragment of some sort, maybe bone, could be a small fragment of the bullet, exits the body. Maybe it doesn't even go through the shirt and the jacket. The rest of the bullet is actually in the body. So when they make the big incision in the neck and they go in, they retrieve that bullet. Okay. The guy who had the clothing was Bill Greer. He was the last guy to leave the emergency area for the Secret Service. He gathered up the clothes. He took them. He's at the morgue. To do a proper postmortem, you've got to have the clothing, right? To look at the clothes. So even though those wounds match up, I'm going to seriously doubt personally, okay, as to what was actually showing on that shirt and jacket at the time they did the autopsy. I mean, Greer had it, never produced it. The whole chain of custody to me is highly questionable. And again, that wound that Humes, that was made so quickly, it was stupid because it's a 45 to 60 degree angle. Okay.
Yeah.
You'd have to have a school book depository that was 15 stories tall and be on the roof shooting. You do the math on that trajectory. That's what makes me believe that thing, and I'll just leave it at that. But I think that wound was fabricated.
I thought when they put the sound in the back wound, that's the first time I've heard of. I thought they estimated at something like 25-30 degrees.
In the autopsy report, it's 45 to 60. That's what Humes put in there.
Okay, that's interesting.
Again, when you're in a hurry, what's the angle mean? I mean, you got to get it approximately right. He was shot from high, from behind. Okay, well, we'll make this false channel here, and But we'll never
Yeah.
know the answer to that because Greer took the clothes, and that's a bit of research. Is if anybody in this community wants to pick up the pieces and run with it, try to establish a timeline on the clothing. You know,
Aren't the fibers in the jacket going inwards?
let's put the coat and jacket. I mean, look at what Rick presented today. If you can't wrap your mind around all this incredible sleight of hand involving another body and alter, what's to say that they didn't the next day or whenever put that shirt and jacket on a mannequin and figure out the spot and basically fire a bullet through it, and then give it to the FBI and say, hey, look at this, it matches up with this back wound. You're never going to convince. And the other thing that Lifton says, Secret Service agent Bennett, and I forget the other individual, said that they were from behind, they saw the bullet strike. But when you look at the Zapruder film, Bennett's head is looking back at the school book depository, and he never, ever looks forward until well after the shot. So Lifton discredits the shot coming in and entering from the back.
Yeah,
I seriously doubt it.
The other one, John Reed or John Reddy. Sorry.
Yeah, there were two witnesses. I forget one was Bennett, the Secret Service. I forget who the other guy was. Both were disproven.
Okay, is that all right, Pete?
Yeah, it's all very interesting. The other thing I just want to say is a fantastic presentation. He made my week.
Thanks, Pete. Johnny, finally, do you want to go ahead? Go ahead, Johnny.
All right, aye. Just the last question for me, guys. It's a bit of speculation I'm asking you to indulge in, but I'm sure you might enjoy. You might enjoy it. If Governor Connolly had in fact died due to his wounds, do you think his autopsy would have been held at Parkland, or do you think his autopsy would have been held at Bethesda? And the second part to that question is, how would Connolly's death have impacted the autopsy of President Kennedy?
Wow, good questions. I don't see how they got the body to Bethesda. I mean, they did it because it was the president. And you had that whole battle, with Theron Ward and a lot of phone calls made to try to just force that situation and get Kennedy's body out of there. But Connolly's the governor of Texas, and he's murdered in Texas. I'd say, but the feds in Bethesda have no jurisdiction over that. I would have to say that Earl Rose would have definitely dug his heels in, and he would have done that autopsy.
And how do you think it would have impacted the autopsy of President Kennedy?
I'd have to give that one some thought, Johnny. I think it's a very good question. And I'm brain dead right now, so
no, just think about it.
I'm going to go have a beer, and I'll put that one under my pillow tonight. How's that?
Good man. Good man.
Okay, terrific. Listen, Brooks and Rick, thank you so much for today. It's been a really, really great presentation. There's a lot of food for thought. Thanks a lot for coming along, and I'll close the meeting here. I'm just going to stop the recording.
Could I just say one thing before we close?
Yes, sure. Yes. Go ahead, Rick. I'm still recording.
I just wanted to inform, the people who are members of your terrific group. I recently started working with a gentleman by the name of Jeff Cradell, who has a podcast called JFK, The Enduring Secret. And he just started a YouTube channel. And I've started working with him on a couple of different episodes we call The Mysteries of the JFK Assassination. So far I've done 2 episodes. One is already on YouTube called The Mystery of Captain Michael D. Groves, talking about the death of that gentleman and how it pertains to his involvement in Bethesda that day. And then I have another episode on the things that we talked about today, a 2-hour episode done with William Law, about the whole 2 morgues situation, 2 bodies, whatever. And that should be airing on YouTube in the next day or so from Jeff Crudell. And that's also called JFK, The Enduring Secret. You can find that on YouTube. And it might be a good way to refer to a lot of the stuff that we talked about today, you know, because it's a 2-hour presentation that really goes over everything from A to Z that I had hoped to share with all of you today, and it might be a good reference source for you as well.
Thanks, Rick. That's really good. I think that's a really good recommendation. Brilliant. Okay, thanks a lot, everyone. I'm just going to stop
Thanks,
the
Rick.
recording
Thanks,
here.
Brooks. Thank you so much.